A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
When I started working as a psychiatrist in a remote Alaskan town, I thought I had encountered all sorts of strange cases. Jessup, the town's only healthcare facility, doubled as a mental health clinic. My next patient was the kind of mystery that only the anonymous whispers of a winter gale could foretell. His name, I can say for certain, wasn't John Smith, but official documents were scarce, and cryptic warnings from superiors about keeping confidentiality were paradoxically mixed with unnerving insistences on continued treatment. The air was thick with secrets as he walked into my office, the only sound the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots fading as he shut the door. Tall, lean, and cloaked in layers that weighed him down like guilt, his eyes bore the fatigue of man who had seen, perhaps even inflicted, unspeakable horrors. My bones shivered as he introduced himself with a dead gaze that mirrored the icy abyss outside. According to what little I could glean from the file, which resembled more of a redacted military dossier than medical records, he had been captured, released, and hushed up by agencies I feared to even hint at in my notes. "John," I began, treating that pseudonym as faithfully as I wished I could treat him, "let's get started." The months to come would peel away his self-crafted personas, unspooling his psyche under tightly coiled pressure. Tortured memories leaked through his narratives, villages where cries for loved ones mixed with the suffocating smoke of fires he and his unit had started. He avoided eye contact when recounting these moments, but something in the way his hands trembled betrayed the truth he wished to keep locked away. His nightly terrors often resurrected the faces of his victims, reflecting the lives snuffed out by the brutality he now carried on his soul like unwashable stains. Each session, my office seemed to fill with the ghosts of his past, phantasmal company I wasn't sure was entirely imagined. HIPAA provisions wound around us like barbed wire while my conscience festered at each revelation. Why was I, a mere therapist in a cold, remote backwater, being entrusted with stories like this? And yet, the more he shared, the clearer it became that the nightmares weren't merely a recount of battlefield torment, but a diary of deeds considered justified on the ledger of war, magnifying the silhouette of a monster created by circumstance. Sitting there, every professional guideline drilled into me warred with the deepening dread that a man capable of such actions was walking free. Somewhere between our sessions, I noticed details slipping, shadows loomed longer, offhand comments from strangers suggested delicate awareness of who my patient really was, someone they had been expecting. One night, a snowstorm raged with an ominous growl, burying tracks and leaving the town gripped in an unsettling absence of sound. That's when he showed up at my front door, soaked and shivering, eyes frantic with the night. Unlike any other. "They're coming for me," he choked out, his voice shredded with fear so raw it left no doubt the ghosts had turned their ethereal claws on him. Caught in his panic, I faced a crossroads I had never conceived, a rebellious urge provoked to breach HIPAA and humanity, a betrayal of the professional oath I took dragged along the frostbitten edges of morality. What if the they he spoke of weren't just in his mind but part of his identity unspooling under sharper scrutiny? As he ranted incoherently on my doorstep, piecing together his final plan of escape, each word painted a mosaic of regret and responsibility unclaimed. The futility of his fight against gory echoes was apparent, but was it my place to wield that knowledge outside of the cramped walls of my home-turned-office? Would I let legislative walls placate the gnawing instinct that perhaps, by treating him, I was complicit in preserving an evil? And then I saw it, a faint red dot flickering through the blinds, like an uninvited oversight pricking the night. We were being watched, or more precisely, he was being watched, and by association, so was I. The knowledge twisted my stomach in a knot of corrosive doubt. Driven to the brink of my professional integrity, I saw the truth clearer than ever, a truth that John Smith already sensed. This was the final hourglass fall. As agents, real or imaginary, closed in around us, desperation etched lines along his face while the realization aged me in the span of mere minutes. His plea for understanding resonated amidst the storm's howls, a requiem mixed with a need for salvation beyond penance. It dawned on me then that John had meticulously unraveled his diary of darkness for his own recorded eulogy. With a steely resolve I never knew I possessed, I embraced the weight of his confession, a resolve to act quicker than the closing jaws encircling us. I grabbed the nearest phone, and against every regulation drilled into me, dialed the number that ensured John Smith wouldn't make the history books of future crimes. As the storm finally seized into a chilling hush, red lights soon blended with white snow. They had arrived. In those last seconds, our eyes met, and a breath of understanding passed, as if he was now at peace with a ghostly tribunal that had long haunted him. When they took him away, my heart still pounded with echoes of his legacy, compounding the fear of what I had done. I wondered if this would serve as justice for him, or mark the beginning of a darker abyss for me. Screw titles like Doctor-Patient Confidentiality. Sometimes the stories we hold in trust need a louder voice to prevent them from being retold in tragedy. No medicine could cure the kind of monsters summoned by fractured memories. Sometimes all it takes is a chance at louder clarity. I always prided myself on being a logical person, so when I first noticed the tree, I convinced myself I was just imagining things. It was a tall, warped pine with a twisted trunk and limbs reaching out like gnarled fingers, standing alone in a dingy clearing behind my apartment complex. I spotted it as I moved in, a slight shiver running down my spine upon its haunted visage, but I tucked that feeling away, attributing it to new house nerves. It was a week later that I noticed it again while taking out the trash. It was evening, and through the pale light of the setting sun, it seemed to sway in a way that was almost too deliberate, as if beckoning me, daring me to approach. The next night, after finishing my homework around 2 in the morning, I glanced out my window and there it was, its silhouette stark against the inky horizon, yet it seemed closer, far too close, its branches curling upward like they were trying to grasp the stars. I told myself it was the shadows playing tricks, but then, when I left the house to go for a late-night walk to clear my head, I discovered it was trailing me. At first, I thought it was the streetlights casting odd shapes, but when I turned down different streets, the tree was there, always just within my line of sight, towering silently among the other trees, its presence both oppressive and oddly sinister. Feeling a panic rise in my chest, I began to pick up my pace, but the more I hurried, the more pronounced its phantom call felt, a low whisper that echoed only in my mind, following me all the way back to my front door. The next day, determined to regain control of my reality, I researched the local lore hoping to find a rational explanation, and in those dusty forums, old-timers spoke of a cursed tree that had been at the center of a terrible ritual gone wrong decades ago, an entity said to latch on to those who acknowledged it. Terrified, I avoided the clearing, choosing to take alternate routes to work and school, but somehow, no matter where I went, I felt its presence, as if its roots crawled beneath the surface of my life, invading every corner. I even tried to convince myself that if I looked away long enough, it would disappear, yet every time I walked with my head down and ran into someone's garbage bin, it was there, an imposing phantom looming over me, hiding in the periphery, and all that time I could hear its scratchy whispering, warning me, so close. Each syllable punctuated by the rustling of leaves, climbing into the cracks of my sanity. 7 days turned into a month, and my friends grew concerned over me, asking why I had become a recluse, why I was pull and jumpy, but how could I explain? So instead, I laughed it off, spun tales of feeling overwhelmed by work, cutting out caffeine, but in reality, I had taken to studying the tree, mapping its movements from my kitchen window, scrawling notes about its growth, timestamps like it was my personal crime investigation, trying to force logic where there was none, desperate to pin down its routine. What I discovered was that while it had always seemed to linger at the edge of my world, there were moments when it would be gone, no matter how brief, its absence amplifying my anxiety to a fever pitch. I would pace my apartment, biting my nails, checking all the locked doors in paranoid bursts, convinced those moments heralded something sinister. It took me nearly losing my sleep altogether to finally gather the courage to confront it in person, thinking that perhaps acknowledging it was the key to breaking this twisted bond that had spiraled into obsession. So that night, with trembling legs and a flashlight burning a weak cone of light ahead of me, I made my way back to the clearing. The air felt electric as I stepped closer, heart thundering in my chest. The tree loomed larger than life, moonlight glistening off the rough bark, and as I held my breath in the moments of surreal defiance, I realized its whispering had morphed. A sinister, hollow laugh now filled the ambience, echoing against the backdrop of silent darkness like it was sharing a joke I couldn't understand. I forced my eyes forward as I stumbled through the underbrush, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet, till I was right in front of it, and for the first time, I could see its trunk was riddled with markings, scratches deep enough to draw blood, words carved in a language I didn't recognize, and suddenly I was gripped with a horror that sunk into my very bones as I felt a twinge of pain in my arm. Pulling back the sleeve of my jacket, I saw deep claw marks carving lines down my skin, fresh and still oozing with blood, but the stinging feel was overshadowed by the chilling feeling that came brushing against me like a breeze, beckoning me to stay, to listen, to finally accept what it wanted. I turned to run, but as I did, something shot through the air, grabbing my ankle, and I stumbled face first into the damp earth, twisting around to see roots curling out of the soil, alive, writhing like serpents, blackening and matted as they pulled me toward the base of the tree, my screams echoing in the stillness of the night. I clawed at the ground, trying to break free, my heart racing as the tree's branches seemed to stretch, looming over me like dark arms threatening to engulf. That laugh returned, softer now, whispering, "You belong to me," mingling with my own desperate cries. In that chilling moment, I realized this was more than an entity but a promise to consume, a fortifying pact that I had unwittingly signed long ago with my curiosity, and as those branches wrapped tighter, an unholy shudder ran through me, unraveling my sanity with each beat of my heart until blackness swallowed me whole. When I finally awoke, there was no sign of the cursed tree, not a single scratch or mark on my body, but as I rose to my feet, disoriented and incredulous, I caught my reflection in an old window. My eyes were black, darkness swirling in their depths, and the realization hit me like a fist. No longer was I its witness, but perhaps its vessel, left to wander from shadow to shadow, forever bound to the woodland curse that had taken root in my very soul.
A promise fulfilled,
Just another leaf on the breeze. I had always considered myself a reasonable person, but that changed the day I accepted an invitation from my husband, Aaron, without consulting him, fully aware that he hated social gatherings and new people, and I can still hear the unsteady beat of my heart as I argued with myself, wondering if I was crossing a line. Yet the thought of being alone at my sister's engagement party gnawed at me. After all, family was important, and Aaron had promised me he'd try harder to connect with my side of the family. But that morning, when I casually mentioned the invitation over breakfast, his face drained of color, and he spat out a fervent no. Like a curse, immediately making my stomach twist with guilt and frustration. As I stared into his coffee, I considered retracting my RSVP, but something inside me flared up. Wasn't it selfish to deprive him of the experience just because he didn't like to socialize? My sister had finally found someone worthy and I wanted us to be present as a united front, sharing in her joy. So with adrenaline coursing through me like cold water, I resolutely sent yes in the group chat, ignoring Aaron's ire simmering just beneath the surface, and when I looked up, I caught him glaring at me, his soft blue eyes now stormy like a brewing tempest. As the days wore on, I tried to play it cool, pretending that the tension lingering between us was just a passing storm, but each night, his hostility coiled tighter around my chest, suffocating me with dread. The day of the engagement party arrived, and with every attempt I made to coax him into a positive mindset, Aaron recoiled further into his shell, poring over a dystopian novel in the dark living room while I dressed in a pale blue dress, feeling like a ghost in my own home, and in the back of my mind, I wondered if I had made a mistake that would haunt us both. With a reluctant sigh, he finally got up, dressed in a shirt that said he'd compromised, but his icy demeanor lingered. The ride felt endless as we zoomed down the road, my knuckles white as I clutched the fabric of my dress, hoping desperately that once we arrived, the warmth of my sister and her fiancé would melt away some of the frost that had settled between us. Entering the venue, the laughter and chatter enveloped us like an embrace while I scanned for familiar faces, and every moment was weighed down by Aaron's discomfort, feeling like a constant pull against the tide of social exuberance swirling around us. As the evening progressed, I tried to engage him, nudging him towards the open bar, the dance floor, and even introducing him to family friends who looked at him with a mix of curiosity and excitement, but each interaction was a missed connection, his stony silence becoming increasingly apparent as he withdrew into his own headspace. Time seemed to stretch unbearably, and as I sipped my drink and laughed a bit too loud at family anecdotes, I caught his eye from across the room, and something inside me snapped. I knew I shouldn't have, but something dark and primal pushed me. "You can't stay cooped up like this forever," I yelled at him over the noise, voice trembling, and the entire room went quiet as Aaron's expression shifted from confusion to something resembling anger before saying, "You did this to me." His words hung in the air like a heavy truth, revealing the crack that had formed in our marriage, and I felt every pair of eyes bore into us, flaring with embarrassment and disbelief while my face flushed hot, eyes stinging with frustrated tears that threatened to fall. So many faces, familiar yet distant, they turned away, shuffling back into their private conversations, leaving me naked in a sea of judgment. But before I could formulate what to say next, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the venue, leaving the laughter behind like a taunting echo in a haunted house, and in that moment, I felt the ground beneath me crumble. I rushed outside after him, heart racing, shouting his name into the night, but only silence met me, the vibrant sounds of the party fading away as I made my way towards the parking lot, the chill of the evening air cutting through my dress. And that's when I saw a flicker of movement at the far end, where I found Aaron leaning against the car, shivering uncontrollably, his breath coming in puffs of gray mist, and when I reached him, his eyes were wide as if he was staring into the abyss, whispers of secrets slipping through his lips, things he'd never said, feelings I never knew existed. He talked about the panic that gripped him, about how he felt like a puppet on strings he didn't want to dance upon, and I felt his vulnerability slice through me, suddenly aware of my selfishness, the realization crushing my chest as I begged for his forgiveness amidst the sobs I refused to hold back. But when he looked at me, his expression shifted again, something darker lurking behind his fidgeting frame, creaking into existence like a shadow pulled from the ground. "You don't get it, do you? You can't control what I do, and in trying to make something of this, you've twisted us into these things we're not." The vulnerability was eclipsed by a rigidness that I couldn't comprehend, the accusing weight of his words feeling like cold steel, and as the night deepened, an unsettling sense crept in like fog. "We need to go home," he said finally, voice hollow, and the chilling finality of it cut through the remaining warmth in the air, so I followed him back inside, trying to piece together the fragments of the evening, but the more we spoke, the more intense his gaze felt like was locking away an ineffable despair, this disquiet pressing heavily upon my chest as if a creature thrived within the silence we now shared. The tension had morphed into something nightmarish, and as we drove back home, the walls of our intimacy closed in, the night stretching endlessly into a void. With every passing moment, dread coursed through me, whispering that we crossed a line that evening, and if I had the chance for a do-over, I would have cancelled that damned invitation. Yet now it felt too late to turn back the clock, and as I lay there that night, raindrops tapping against the window, sleep eluded me, each thunderous beat of my heart loud enough to drown out the silence between us, begging for the solace of an explanation that may never come. All I could do was stare into the dark, wondering if it was really the invitation that made me the asshole, or if I had unwittingly opened a door that should have remained firmly shut. When my best friend Jenna called to ask if her cousin Mara could stay at my place for a few weeks, I hesitated. Jenna was a dear friend, and favors like this were part of our unspoken pact. But the problem was something that haunted me every time I let others into my private domain. 3 months ago, during a separate houseguest incident, a routine shampoo had turned into a catastrophe. The hair products I used were not ordinary, they were concoctions of bespoke formulas, artisan blends that I humorously referred to as my elixirs. Expensive? Definitely. But they had a purpose beyond vanity. The fragrant potion had been gifted by an old acquaintance who claimed its lineage traced back to some ancient text. My hair, unruly and always threatening to escape into a tangled mess, was finally tamed under its guidance, and I'd do anything to keep it that way. Mara arrived late one rainy evening, bringing with her an aura of unpredictability, and perhaps it was the streak of storms that ignited the unease in my veins. She was all charms and pleasantries, a tempest of charisma bound in a petite frame with eyes that flickered like candle flames. The first few days were harmless enough, in that superficial way where you reside with someone under civilities but sense a looming dissonance. We danced around each other's schedules, and I felt comforted by the distance. That was until the second week, when something, more specifically, someone, went missing. Its absence was loud in the hushed whispers of the bathroom. My conditioner was gone. Though at first convinced that I had misplaced it, a sick feeling curdled in my stomach. My space wasn't large, my discipline strict. When did I ever misplace anything? I confronted Mara in the gentlest manner, masking my suspicion behind the veil of casual inquiry. She laughed, a tinkle of innocence mingled with disbelief, expressing her gratitude for letting her stay, and insisted she had no need for my highbrow products. Her insistence came with a gaze unwavering. Perhaps, I thought in a fleeting moment, she genuinely didn't know. Surrendering to an air of unwarranted guilt, I insisted it was a misunderstanding and fatefully decided to hide the rest of my concoctions. They went in a lacquered box under my bed, a childhood gift embellished with garish designs, the inside lined with fabric worn thin by time but enough to conceal what mattered. That night I awoke to the sound of humming, a melody unknown, carrying through the walls like a current. Soft, then swelling with unsanctioned vibrato. It wasn't a song for the living, whispering secrets in a language forgotten. I was up, out of my bedsheet's warmth, trailing like a ghost in the moonlit drafts towards the source. The sound lured me into a trance, one step after another until I stood outside the bathroom door, ajar. Mara was inside. A faint orange glow encircled the door's edge like fingers of light creeping outwards. My heart thundered an offbeat percussion as I pushed the door. There she was, twirling, a silhouette in eerie motion, and every strand of her hair moved as if lifted by otherworldly hands. The shampoo bottle lay empty on the tiles, the cap lost in a bubble of froth foaming at her feet. The room reeked of something pungent and unfamiliar. The residue of lavender was chasing a shadow scent, something darker, perhaps sulphurous. What I witnessed was beyond comprehension. Her hair wreathed from her skull in tendrils, each as if possessed. With every twist, they danced, entangled in an embrace with the air itself. And Mara? She was laughing haphazardly, an intoxicating blend of joy and fear, her reflection distorted in fragmented light. The elixir had done this. I realized with dawning horror that my old acquaintance had not so much gifted me a boon as cursed me with latent danger. Those ancient promises of beauty had hinged on peril balanced in the precarious duty of secrecy. The laughter turned to panic as her eyes snapped toward me, pupils widened with an infinitesimal universe of dread. She pleaded without words as if I could stop it, reverse the spell. But I was frozen, stuck on the precipice of inertia and terror, not knowing how to break the hold. The sound crescendoed into a final climactic silence as abruptly, she stopped, and the tendrils of hair settled back onto her shoulders with languid defeat. She crumpled to the floor, elixir seeping into the drain's mouth, veins of alabaster porcelain spreading out to the world below. In the ensuing chaos, the air lay heavy with explanations. Mara, now silent and transformed by the knowledge of the unseen, unsettling truths that no guest should bear. She didn't speak of it again, as if acknowledging its presence might tether her back to that ephemeral spell. I disposed of the remnants thoroughly, heedful this time of the extra set of eyes watching with silent empathy for the secrets I've harbored, now shared. Mara left, gratitude unspoken but intense, layered with understanding. Jenna never asked why everything changed or why Mara seemed more shadow than flesh when she returned home. The incident lived on, locked within our mutual silence, a tale better left to darker corners. I might be the asshole for hiding the damn conditioner, but I learned, a valuable lesson bled from the teachings of ancient sorcery and human folly, that some doors are better left unopened, even in the comfort of one's own home. I'm not proud of my decision, but I'm hoping that sharing this will help someone understand what I went through. My name's Kyle, and I'm 34, just trying to navigate life when everything went sideways. You see, 2 years ago, my wife Emma and I bought a quaint little house, a fixer-upper nestled in a quiet neighborhood where the trees whispered sweet, serene secrets. It felt like a beacon of hope after the relentless grind of renting for what seemed like an eternity, and we agreed on a budget for renovations that might occasionally stretch, but within limits. Life was good until the weight of anxiety crept in like a shadow at dusk. Emma had lost her job, and the financial strain of the mortgage started gnawing at her like a rat gnaws at a meal left unattended. I saw the worry etched on her face, the sleepless nights, the way she would wake up gasping for breath after nightmares filled with us losing everything. It crushed me. I learned to juggle bills in silence, covering the late fees and the ever-growing utilities, and my heart ached while knowing she thought we were on the brink of disaster. So, one dark night, I made the choice to dig into my savings, a stash I had assembled over years for a rainy day, and paid off the mortgage without telling her. The feeling of liberation was exhilarating, a weight lifted, like I was clawing back control of our lives. I imagined how ecstatic Emma would be, picturing her sweet smile lighting up the room when I let her know. But that joy was short-lived because my plan collided with reality in a way I never saw coming. 3 days after I paid it off, Emma stumbled upon the paperwork while organizing our records, and what followed was a storm I never expected. The look on her face was a mix of confusion and hurt betrayal, eyes brimming with tears as she accused me of making unilateral decisions about our future, of stripping away her agency, and it was like a knife twisting in my gut. I tried to explain that my intentions were good, that I wanted to relieve her anxiety, but my words felt hollow, echoing against the walls of a home that suddenly felt suffocatingly small. That night, the house felt like a prison, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of our fraying connection. Emma was silent, her back turned to me, and I could hear the soft tremors of her sobs swallowing my attempts at reassurance. I knew I had crossed a line, but deep down, I believed paying off the mortgage would free us, that it was an act of love. But love, I learned the hard way, isn't about salvaging your happiness by sacrificing another's. Days turned into weeks, and while I thought the anger would fade, it only deepened her wounds. We barely spoke, and each passing moment felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. I kept replaying old memories, how we laughed together, the way dreams of a loving family danced in her eyes, but now, they felt tainted, like dusty photographs hidden away in a forgotten album. I saw it. Forgiveness, but it was clear that my actions were branded on the fabric of our relationship. I even tried to make additional gestures, cooking dinner, cleaning up, surprising her with flowers, but nothing seemed to bridge the gap my thoughtless act had created. One night, after she returned from a frail attempt at therapy, I saw her sitting at the table, head in hands, and it struck me, she wasn't just grieving over the house or the loss of security, she was mourning the trust we had shared, which I dismantled in a moment of selfish desperation. The feeling of loneliness wrapped around me tighter than the fear of losing her. She asked me if I would have still gone through with it if she had said no, and the question hung in the air like a dark storm cloud. I couldn't answer. Despite my intentions rooted in love, I had betrayed her in a way that felt unforgivable. Eventually, the conversation shifted from sorrow to futility. She no longer wanted to talk about what I had done, and the silence felt deafening. Emma found her own ways to cope. She buried herself in her career search but left a lingering coldness between us that spoke volumes. I watched in painful despair as she transformed from my once vibrant partner into someone barely recognizable. Her laughter became rare, and the light behind her eyes dimmed. I lost my job soon after, just a small startup going under during a market crash, and suddenly, I was in a deep pit of despair alongside her. We both were stuck in this bleak limbo of regret as the reality of my impulsive choice sank in, the irony not lost on me that the very act I thought would heal us had instead ushered us into a silent war. Friends who used to visit started avoiding our home, sensing the tension, the way we exchanged furtive glances during group gatherings that felt like a performance we were tired of rehearsing. One night, after a complicated dinner discussion turned into a screaming match over mundane chores, I realized the house felt tainted, a physical embodiment of our unraveling relationship. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear it all down and start fresh, but the reality was, we were still trapped in the bones of our choices. I kept asking myself if I was truly the asshole, if I had thrown away our marriage for a moment of misguided courage. I felt I had grown over the months, evolving into someone willing to admit his mistakes, preparing to restore what I could, but the damage was like a fracture that wouldn't mend. Then came the night everything changed, for better or worse, I still can't tell. Emma came home late, the smell of cheap wine clinging fiercely to her like a shadow. For the first time in months, she looked liberated, a spark of something flickering in her eyes. I hesitated, unsure of how to approach the storm brewing inside me. "I quit my job," she said bluntly as if it was an everyday revelation. My heart raced, shock, fear, confusion tangled together into one dense knot. Before I could ask anything, she continued, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About me. About everything." I braced myself as she spoke, her words spilling out rapidly, tinged with an urgency I hadn't seen from her in ages. She explained that she needed to figure out who she was without what we built together, that maybe taking the reins of her life and allowing some distance could help her regain clarity about our future. A whirlwind of emotions cascaded through me, fear mingled with a bitter sense of pride. I thought I was trying to save us by taking control, but perhaps we needed to unravel ourselves separately. And that was when I made my latest decision. I needed to let her go so she could find herself. In that instant, saying goodbye felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. Emma had transformed into someone who was wronged but also became a mirror reflecting my own flaws, and with every hug, every word left unsaid, I wondered if we'd find our way back someday or if we were permanently marked by this tragedy of broken intentions. 6 months lived apart unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Nights were filled with a loss that transformed into too many what-ifs threading through my mind. The haunting image of her walking out that door stayed with me, the sound of the lock clicking echoing like the final note of a lamenting melody. I learned to navigate the empty rooms, the silence a deafening reminder of what I had done and what I had lost. I still held on to the hope that maybe one day Emma would understand the depths of my love, even if it was colored by my mistakes, but every flicker of hope dimmed further away as the days passed. Ultimately, the walls of our home, that beacon of hope, crumbled under the weight of naivete, and I was left with memories and regrets, staring blankly at the corners that once held warmth, now forever shadowed by betrayal, wondering how one decision could change everything. I don't know if I'm the asshole. I've lived with this tumult of emotions that mire my soul, but I realized sometimes in our love, it's the things we hide, the choices we make in the name of love, that can lead us down an uncharted, dark path. It all started the night I found Sarah lifeless on the living room floor, eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. My heart seized as I knelt beside her, shaking her shoulders, calling her name over and over. No response. No pulse. Cold. I don't really remember what happened after that. It's all a hazy whirl of panic, the desperate fumbling for my phone, dialing 911, and the helpless hours waiting in stark hospital corridors. The doctors said they couldn't find a cause of death, which twisted my grief into a darker shade of confusion until I did something I never thought I'd do. I went home, sat in our shared silence, and scoured through her things, desperate for answers. That's when I stumbled upon her journal wedged underneath the mattress on her side of the bed. The pages were filled with her handwriting, but as I read, it became chillingly clear these were not the musings of a woman in distress, but a collection of memories that weren't quite hers. First, they seemed like normal entries, birthday parties, vacations, mundane reflections about work and us, but as I delved deeper, the ink communicated a life unfamiliar to Sarah, a life where she'd never met me, details of childhood events she'd never mentioned, entire lifetimes she'd supposedly lived, none involving our life together. Each journal entry felt as if it was penned in another dimension, until I came across yesterday's date. There, in eerie precision, she described how I'd find her unresponsive on the floor, and that this was just as it should be. The reality pierced me as if shot by an invisible arrow. My wife had been a ghost writing her own existence. She wove tales for herself in overlapping realities. I dropped the journal in shock as the room spun around me. Then, as if commanded by an unseen script, I was drawn to her computer, her email marked drafts as if glowing. One draft was devoid of the usual pleasantries. To me, it felt like a confessional, more than a message. In maddening detail, it unraveled her life as an experiment, governed by something or someone beyond my comprehension. It insinuated I was an unwitting participant, cocooned in an elaborate illusion of love, and eerily suggested neither of us were truly alive, just echoes of a greater consciousness whims. As these truths incubated my newfound paranoia, the reality I clung to fragmented. A phone call with her mother insisting Sarah had no siblings when I distinctly remembered visiting a sister's gravesite with Sarah, the sudden absence of our wedding photos from every corner of our home, our neighbor recoiling in confusion when I asked about the block party they hosted just last month, which now they denied ever having planned. I felt the walls closing in, like an actor gripping at the fourth wall, begging for soliloquy. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, only peer over the edge of my sanity into the abyss of possibility that our entire life together might be a deranged fiction. Then, came the final email, new, and only partly formed, as if it had written itself, a collection of timestamps, culminating in one-line conclusions that demanded the attendance of audiences in other realms. My heart dropped as I realized these audiences might just be those who are living our story, observing us, passing off our fears, our sufferings as entertainment. As of this morning, Sarah's body is gone without a trace, the police just another actor refusing to remember her existence, the house void of all evidence she resided within these walls. With each tick of the clock, I feel my own tangible sense of being slipping, a mere performer outlasting his epilogue. In the corners of this draft are whispers of endings and beginnings, a design suggesting this confession will eventually abduct me from my tether of sanity into the audience's embrace. I have no proof of my utterances, no photos, no forgotten keepsakes save for a fading scent on her pillow, just this typed echo, tirelessly reaching out. But I realize now, none of it matters, because in reality, our existence, my existence, might simply be a page you turn, a story you read before bed. As I press send, I wonder if winding your disbelief into belief might be the only real possession I have left. After all, in a world where the lines between life, death, and fantasy blur, who can truly say what never was? There's a certain unsettling power in words, especially when they're echoing around an empty office late at night. This realization hit me hard after what initially seemed like an average day at work, but in reality, turned into something far more eerie. It all started when I overheard hushed murmurs from my colleagues that my weight had apparently become the hottest topic of their gossip. It felt like my very presence was the joke. Initially, I brushed it off, thinking their jabs were just a poor attempt at humor. That was until the voices followed me home. For context, I work at a mid-sized marketing agency where stress runs as rampant as the rumors. Hey, have you seen Andrea's snack stash? I bet she's got a whole pantry in there. It wasn't the first time I had dealt with such comments, but over time they seeped into my consciousness like poison. The laughter, at first hushed, evolved into an all-consuming noise in my head, an omnipresent mockery that only quieted when I wasn't alone. Desperate to escape the stinging barbs that haunted me even in my solitude, I mustered the courage to speak up. Not that I expected any grand outcome from our eternally busy, disinterested supervisor. But the growing discomfort gnawed at my sanity to the point where silence was no longer an option. Our supervisor, Lisa, an acerbic woman perpetually tethered to her phone, listened with one eyebrow cocked in apparent disinterest. To my surprise, she agreed to talk to those involved. I left her office with a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. The next day, instead of the laughter subsiding, I found my Gmail inundated with anonymous emails. Sayings no longer just a whisper in my ear now boomed as blocks of text that accused, mocked, and threatened. Saying I had an overactive imagination or claiming I was making a big deal out of nothing. It seemed my coworkers not only found humor in my plight but took malicious pleasure from my distress. Unease curled around my spine as I began receiving phone calls late into the night, voices distorted by static, yet no less familiar. They never spoke of their identity, only that they knew what I did at work, punctuating the silence with choked laughter. The cowardice of anonymity cloaked them as they uttered things no human should hear. Nights became unbearable. During one such call, the electricity flickered, plunging my apartment into a shadowy void. As I fumbled for my flashlight, the words on the other end grew more frenzied as if they were feeding off my terror, morphing from taunts about my way to something more sinister, curses invoking misfortune, darkness, and fear that blurred the line of reality. I could almost feel someone, or something, in the house with me, watching, relishing my helplessness. Then came the dreams, or were they visions? I'd wake up drenched in sweat, a shadowy figure looming at the edge of my bed, always fading just as consciousness reclaimed me. And in those moments, when the veil between dream and reality seemed razor thin, I swore I heard familiar voices swirling in the air, taunting, merging with the constant buzzing of those damn emails, filling my head with incessant buzzing. My rational self knew this was impossible, but fear is rarely logical. The paranoia escalated until I began seeing my suspicions confirmed in the subtlest glances from co-workers, in clandestine meetings that dissolved as soon as I entered the room. Did they know? Were they all in on it? Was it some twisted corporate experiment gone wrong? Sleep-deprived and caught in an endless loop of anxiety, I became reckless enough to confront Susan, one of the suspected ringleaders. Her reaction, a blank stare devoid of any emotion, was almost more chilling than the phantom calls. "It's not real," I told myself. "It's all in my head." But the true horror was realized one dismal evening when Lisa called me into a darkened boardroom. Her usual detached demeanor was replaced with something akin to urgency. "Andrea," she began, "we need to talk." Her typical disdain was gone, replaced by something raw and unnerving. Before I could react, the lights dimmed and the projector flickered to life. Grainy footage danced across the screen. It was me, captured in vulnerable moments over the past weeks. I watched in silent terror as clips showed me tossing and turning in bed, startled awake by whispers, haggard and shadow-eyed at my office desk. "This isn't just office chatter anymore. Someone wants to harm you," Lisa murmured, her voice strangled with sincerity, or was it guilt? The room seemed to hum with a living presence, yielding a weight so oppressive I felt my breath catch. The next words froze the very air. "I thought you might be behind it, but if you're watching this for the first time too, we have a problem." A chill coursed through my veins as Lisa confessed she hadn't believed me at first. That she took part in sending the emails, thinking I needed the humiliation to build character. It was part of the corporate culture, an initiation hazing of sorts, she explained, albeit reluctantly. But then it morphed beyond their control, something darker imbuing the once innocent, even if cruel, office jokes. Someone had added an unforeseen malevolent twist. Who has been filming this? The question hung in the air heavy with terror, but the room offered no answers, just a mocking reflection of fear back at us. Lisa's plan, a desperate grasp at recovery, was to notify the authorities, but I had already transcended trust in institutional safety. As I exited the building that night, the city seemed different, colder, with shadows clad in malicious secrets. That's when I realized this wasn't just an unveiled prank, nor was it a simple workplace dilemma. This was an intrusion beyond the office, a wicked crossing of boundaries with sinister origins. Whether spectral or born from a colleague's twisted psyche, something had found a way to animate my nightmares, to solidify whispers into something physically paralyzing. And as I walked past the residual chatter of the city's streets, those same distorted voices echoed once more, no longer just a metaphorical haunting but an unnerving reminder that some darkness you can't just report to HR. You can't possibly tell what's real once the shadows decide to play. When my therapist, Dr. Hendricks, suggested the experimental therapy session, he regarded it like magic, sprinkling my life with transformative stardust that only a few privileged souls got to experience. The air in his office hung with a thick, lingering anticipation crammed with books wearing the dust of forgotten centuries. Dr. Hendricks, an eccentric blend of sharp eyes and warm demeanor, leaned forward and said, "This will change your life, Claire." My heart, hopeful and reckless, danced at the promise. He called it subconscious immersion therapy, and I was the perfect candidate, a young, resilient mind tormented by the echoing unrest of an untraceable anxiety. The concept was deceptively simple. I would plunge into a guided journey inside my subconscious, mining the depths of my psyche to confront and understand the fears that tethered me to sleepless nights. Within the safe boundaries defined by Dr. Hendricks, my consciousness would be expanded and narrowed all at once, peeling back the layers of my mind like an onion, until the pungent core was finally revealed. The session began with me lying on a plush chaise, listening to the rhythmic, dulcet tones of a metronome as a strange device was placed on my head, connecting me to the computers that hummed a low, comforting lullaby. "You're going to feel a slight tingling sensation," Dr. Hendricks explained as his words swirled around me like leaves caught in a gentle autumn breeze. I nodded, feeling a prickling warmth bleed through my veins, each pulse a promise of transcendental revelations. As my eyelids fluttered shut, the world receded, leaving behind the shadow of the metronome's resolute ticks. That's when I became aware of the darkness, a profound, all-encompassing void that was both a blank slate and a canvas waiting to be tainted by buried memories. Instead of fear, a deep and curious respite cradled my consciousness, urging me to explore further. Suddenly, I was standing in my childhood bedroom, the walls still painted with wildflowers my mother had lovingly stenciled in my youthful days. Moonlight danced through the sheer curtains, casting intricate patterns on the hardwood floor. Everything was eerily untouched by time, except for the photograph by my bedside, one that was never actually there. My hands trembling, I picked it up, revealing an image of a family dinner. Except it wasn't from my memories, I'd never seen these people before. They laughed, their joy infectious in a memory that wasn't mine to begin with. The sensation of unease intensified, like a spider crawling up my spine. But the room, as if alive and sentient, urged me forward, inhaling and exhaling with a life of its own. Distant whispers echoed in the hallway, compelling me to step through the door. My feet, leaden yet determined, carried me towards the voices that slithered through the walls, a chorus of people trapped in the folds of my subconscious. I found myself in a grandiose dining room, a mishmash of periods, clashing from ancient to modern, a kaleidoscope of time lost and forgotten. At the table sat figures with faces blurred as though out of focus in a dream. It was terrifyingly familiar, like trying to recall a nightmare upon waking. The figures engaged in a symphony of garbled conversations, their voices rising and falling in chaotic crescendos around me. Among them was a mirror, old and cracked, reflecting not my face but a tapestry of emotions, rage, despair, love, all flickering in flashes like distant lightning. In that instant, the room shuddered, the illusion faltered, unraveling the threads of my fateful tapestry. Faces of the people in the photographs started forming clearer images, and one by one, they turned towards me, their eyes lifeless yet piercing as if questioning my presence. Panic carved its way into my chest but curiosity, relentless and seductive, urged me on. I stumbled backward, my fingers entwining in the web of lies my own mind had woven. With a blink, the scene dissolved, leaving me amidst a swirling mist, a timeless wasteland devoid of life. Here, a solitary figure waited, an elderly woman with eyes that matched mine, ageless pearls in a cavernous ocean of shadows. She sang a lullaby in a language I knew but couldn't place, resonating through my being until it unlocked memories I didn't know I had hidden. Glimpses of another life flashed before me, glories and mistakes woven into the tapestry I had partially unraveled. Before I could grasp the totality of this revelation, her voice penetrated my consciousness, a whisper that shook the core of my reality. Never forget that you are the architect of your existence, and what you bury will always find its way back to light. Suddenly, the room fell silent, the world frozen in its tracks as I gasped, my soul trembling on the precipice between discovery and despair. With a jerk, I awoke on the chaise in Dr. Hendricks's office, drenched in sweat and heart pounding like war drums. His eyes studied me intently, satisfaction, a veneer masking something far deeper, etched into his gaunt features. "You've seen it, haven't you? You've uncovered the truth," he stated in knowing calmness that unsettled me. But as I reached for words, I found my voice caged by the echoes of the mirror's emotions still reverberating within. In the days that followed, my perspective shifted, as did the world around me. Colors, brighter and more vibrant than ever, mocked my blind ignorance. Memories resurfaced unbidden, piecing together fragments of forgotten lives with mine as the centerpiece. Relationships crumbled under the weight of sudden, inexplicable knowledge I couldn't share without unraveling the very fabric of my existence. My connection with reality twisted like threads caught in a gale, each revelation shaping and reshaping who I thought I was. And Dr. Hendricks, always present in the shadow of my newfound awareness, kept warning me that the journey had only begun, that I must embrace or refute the riddled identity my subconscious had revealed. No longer anchored to the ordinary, I've been restlessly exploring the boundaries of my life, a dichotomy of light and shadow guiding my path. What I apprehended in that experimental therapy has unfurled an enigmatic labyrinth I am both terrified and compelled to navigate. Every night, I dip into dreams that fracture the line between reality and illusion, knowing that monstrous truths lie coiled in the heart of my existence, ready to ensnare me in their unforeseen embrace. This therapy dislodged more than I could have fathomed. It awoke a relentless metamorphosis, and I am forever altered, living on borrowed breaths among strangers I once called my own. I had always known that the jungle held secrets, but I never imagined it could swallow you whole. When I heard about the jaguar, the one my comrades warned me about as we sipped cheap beer by the fire in our dilapidated town, I shrugged it off, just another ghost story to frighten bar-hopping tourists and drunk locals. They said no one returns from the jaguar, that the last group of explorers vanished without a trace, leaving only whispers of their last moments. But the truth can be a seductive beast, and when I found an old, leather-bound journal tucked away in my grandfather's attic, I became enthralled. His scrawled notes spoke of an ancient temple deep within the South American jungle, where jaguars roamed like shadows, and where the line between life and death blurred into something sinister. Curiosity led me to gather a few brave souls, all armed with machetes and bravado, into my ramshackle pickup, and off we went into the festering embrace of the jungle, the air thick with humidity and ancient secrets. Days passed in a haze of sweat, adrenaline, and disillusionment. We fought vines, mosquitoes, and our own fading hope as the map undulated like a mirage. It was on the fifth night, beneath a canopy so dense we could barely glimpse the stars, that the jungle revealed its true nature. An eerie stillness settled around us, and that was when we heard it. A low growl emanated from the thick underbrush, resonating deep in my chest, a primal sound that sent chills down my spine. The air shifted, shadows lengthened. One by one, my friends urged caution, but I felt an uncontrollable urge to push deeper. It wasn't long before Phil, the jokester of our group, began to chuckle nervously, lightheartedly daring the unseen predator to show itself. But I wasn't laughing. It was as if the very jungle held its breath, waiting. The night sank into madness when Lisa, ever the skeptic, decided to venture off, convinced that it was all in our heads, that the jungle was simply a bundle of old wives' tales. I didn't have the courage to follow her, but I watched helplessly as she disappeared into the thick foliage, swallowed by the darkness, her laughter echoing eerily until it just stopped. We called her name until it felt like a mantra, but the jungle swallowed our prayers. That's when we understood the truth. Once someone entered the shadows of the jaguar, they never came back. A suffocating dread wrapped around our hearts, and we named it the curse, repeating it like a chant as we huddled together, broken by the weight of our fears. We decided to return the next day, a futile mission to find Lisa, but each step seemed heavier than the last. I felt the jungle's pulse beneath my feet, a quiet thrumming that mirrored my rising panic. As the hours dragged, I'm not even sure how we lost track of time. That's when I spotted something out of the corner of my eye. Twinkling eyes watching us from the shadows, too many to count, their shapes indistinguishable in the faint light. Then, as if the very jungle responded to our despair, a piercing scream shattered the silence, echoing from the depths of darkness. We froze, recognizing that terrified voice, and our hearts shattered as we rushed toward the sound with no thought of our own safety. We found Lisa's backpack first, torn and abandoned, drenched in mud, and the trail of her scream fading into silence felt like a grave marker for our last flickers of hope. I knew we couldn't stay. Shadows loomed closer, their presence wrapping around us, thick and suffocating. But escape proved futile. The jungle twisted and turned like a living, breathing thing, carving us deeper into its hungry maw. Phil snapped, driven mad by fear, yelling for the jaguar to come for him, claiming it couldn't be worse than what we faced, and as if summoned by his desperation, the jungle answered. I felt the ground shake, a sensation like thunder rumbling at our feet. Out of the thickening mist, a figure appeared, massive and dark, the legendary jaguar. Its eyes glowed like twin moons in the night, ancient and wise, yet feral and hungry, a primal creature that seemed to embody the jungle itself. We staggered back, fear clenching our throats, but Phil stood firm, trembling yet defiant, challenging fate with a wild laugh. The jaguar simply watched, unblinking, as shadows began to peel away from the trees, coiling closer around us, making our skin itch. It was no longer a choice. We bolted, desperation propelling us through the chaos, but the jungle had transformed. Vines snaked around our ankles, unseen forces tugged at our shirts, pulling us back into its embrace. I lost sight of Phil, swallowed by the undergrowth, and his screams merged with the roaring wilderness, something monstrous and utterly devoid of hope. I pressed on, engulfed by terror, aware that each moment stretched to an eternity. Just as I thought freedom was a breath away, an unspeakable darkness wrapped itself around me, drowning out sound, until there was nothing but me. I stumbled blindly through the fever dream of foliage, until I found myself collapsed against trees that seemed to lean in, watching intently, hungry for my surrender. The jungle had taken Lisa, had consumed my friends, and now it was eager for my acceptance of my fate. The stillness whispered promises to me, sweet nothings wrapped in despair, and I felt the jaguar's presence looming, licking its lips just outside of my vision. But deep in my heart, a fire flared. I refused to be another whisper in this cursed jungle. I focused on the heat of the sun, just a faint memory, and ran, the world a blur of green and brown, until I caught the first glimpse of light breaking through the foliage. My heartbeat drowned out all sound around me, and I plowed through the trees, emerged onto a narrow riverbank, lungs burning with the exhilaration of feeling air on my face. I'd made it. But as I turned around to catch my breath, the jungle behind me fell eerily silent, and the jaguar emerged from the shadows, leaving a void of darkness where my friends had once stood, their laughter now echoes of insanity. The creature stepped closer, and I could see its eyes, dark and pleading, as if it were born of the jungle itself, and somehow, I knew, this was not the end for me, but the beginning of a deeper mystery. I backed away, never breaking my gaze, until its breath hitched, and I felt it, a cold touch pulling me back, and everything went black. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, but something was off. The world felt different. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and spotted jagged scratches on my arms, remnants of vines pulling me back. I turned around, and in the faint light of dawn, there stood the journal, open on my bedside table, its pages yellowed and crumbling, and there, scrawled in the margins, were the names of my friends, all crossed out except for mine. I gazed into the mirror, and the darkness in my eyes mirrored the truth. I had returned, but I was never meant to escape the jaguar. No one ever does. In small bursts of recognition, I began to understand what I had become, the ultimate whisper of the jungles, another lost soul bound to an ancient curse, destined to roam between worlds. I turned around once more to see rows of eyes peering from the shadows beyond my window. They'll come back for you, I thought, as the light faded and darkness embraced me whole. I never believed in the strange, meaningless whispers that danced around our town like the fog at dusk, but that was before I discovered God. I remember the first time I heard the old man in the diner talk about him, slurring his words through a glass of cheap whiskey, eyes glistening with manic reverie as he described a figure cloaked in shadows, a thing that lurked just outside the reach of dawn. He said God was a starving animal, relentless and hungry, prowling for souls instead of prey. I brushed it off, a storyteller's concoction, right until the strange occurrences began punctuating my nights with a surreal urgency. It started with shadows on the wall, flickering so quickly that they almost slipped my mind until they twisted into grotesque faces, mouths stretched wide in silent screams as if pleading for help. I tried to dismiss them. My friends laughed when I told them, death and grief had never been strangers in our community, but my life had been relatively mundane, and the town around us was supposedly safe, chosen for its seclusion, nestled between the mountains like a secret. But the moment I began to notice those shadows, it felt as if everything shifted. Whispers grew louder, warning of something I could not define yet knew I could not ignore, a chilling reminder that something was waiting. It yearned for my surrender. It was the night of the storm, the air thick and electric, the rain hammering on rooftops like drums of war. When I lay in bed, unable to find solace, I caught sight of a figure outside my window, barely distinguishable against the downpour, colossal against the night but somehow bending with the wind, its body a massive writhing shadow that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my troubled heartbeat. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but low battery, just my luck, and when I looked back up, it was closer. There was a moment of stillness where time hung in the air, heavy like the tension between my heartbeats, and in that fog of disbelief, I blinked, only to find the animal at my doorstep, a monstrous blend of innocence and malice with eyes that shone like two burning coals demanding attention, its breath a whispering wind that carried all the unanswered prayers I had buried deep in my heart. Fear clawed at my insides, but God looked so starved, its thin frame riddled with ribs protruding like the jagged edge of bone idolin, drool pooling at its feet like a grotesque blessing, pulling me closer like I owed him something. I didn't know it then, but that shared glance invoked the hunger in me too, a hollow pit where my confidence had been, and I realized then, God was asking for believers. He was asking for sacrificial offerings, not of flesh, but of fear and pain, and my life could easily be the first course of a distorted banquet. It was days before I managed to shake off that encounter, weeks of restless nights with God lurking perpetually in the corner of my eye, an impressive beast lurking within my thoughts, gnawing at my sanity like it gnawed on its invisible meals, taunting me closer until my dreams twisted into landscapes filled with gnarled trees, shadows leaping and shifting, the ghastly howls of what seemed like distant cries haunting me. My friends began to see too, their faces drawn and hovering over the edge of belief, as if they sensed the approaching storm, but they just brushed it aside, thinking it was just me unraveling, or they hoped, at least, until one by one, they started disappearing. All at once, our little town filled with confusion, prayer circles formed, eyes started toward the nights full of fear, loss had become all too familiar, and I was left feeling like a spectator, the shadows gathering, a tightening noose around my throat as I started to wonder if God had developed a taste for something specific. I was terrified of awakening something deep in me, a submission to God's call that I felt scratching beneath my skin every night. The day I lost Jamie was absolute chaos. I remember us sitting in the park, sharing stories under a muted sky, but Jamie's laughter turned silent too soon. She just disappeared, fading into the cool fall air, the shadows all around, and there was nothing left but a whisper lamenting in her wake, the unnerving reality that if God was a starving animal, then we were the feast, and I was the next course. I could feel him lurking behind my eyelids, scratching and clawing to take control, whispering threats like delicate promises under curling shadows, the chilling truth that hunger does not care who it consumes, and every day I felt closer to becoming part of that dark circle, entangled within God's twisted appetite while I walked amongst the living, haunted and hollow, enemies of my own sanity stirring until I didn't know whether I was the hunter or the hunted. The fractured gods of my nightmares promised a hunger never sate, a cycle of consumption that would never end unless someone stepped into the darkness, and each day, I struggled to tear myself away as the remaining few turned to me in desperation, searching for answers. Could I be a savior? And the truth gnawed at me even more viciously as I realized, a part of me wanted to step into the dawn and take the place of the feast, to lead them away from God's insatiable maw as dusk fell once more, knowing full well that no offerings could quell the appetite of a starved being. And so here I stand, trembling at the altar of darkness, eyes blindsided by shadows, as I hear the soft scratching lullabies drawing closer, whispering my name as if I, too, would soon find my way into that eternal banquet where God waits, starved yet voracious, and I must not, become the next offering to the hollow growl that has wrenched its way into my very soul. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until the night a girl appeared on our front stoop, a quiet silhouette against the flimsy glow of the porch light. At first, I thought she was just a trick of the shifting shadows. I watched her through the peephole, hair cascading down her shoulders like a waterfall of midnight, eyes fixed and unblinking on the door. She looked as real as the chilled air biting at the windows, but when I called for my husband, Mike, and turned back to the peephole, she was gone. I dismissed it as a misremembered dream until she showed up the next night at precisely the same spot. This time, I swung the door open and felt my breath hitch. It was as if she dissolved into the night air, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves behind. Confused and a bit shaken, I told Mike, who laughed it off, suggesting I was working too many late nights. But this became a pattern. Every night, exactly at 2:04 a.m., she'd be there, sometimes wailing so quietly it was almost inaudible, like a lullaby weaved with despair. I became obsessed, watching the clock as the seconds ticked down to her appearance, insomniac anticipation forming knots in my stomach. One chilling night, curiosity eclipsed fear, and I stepped outside to confront her. As I walked forward, the cold leached through my robe, chilling my bones. She stood unmoving, and when I reached out, my fingers touched nothing but cold air. No prints on the dew-slicked steps, no sign that a living soul had been there. Frustrated, I retreated back inside, only to glimpse her face, pale and pleading, mouth moving soundlessly. I turned on every light in the house, praying for the sun to rise, and researched until dawn, spiraling down rabbit holes about spirits, poltergeists, and time slips that seemed to share echoes of her haunting presence. We spoke to neighbors, hoping for validation or explanation, but they responded with confused glances and dismissive chuckles. During the day, I tore through old photographs, local history books, anything that could reveal who she was or what she wanted, but hit nothing but dead ends. The next night, when she appeared, I tried talking to her, asking if she was lost or in need of help, but was met with silence. I shouted, pleaded, and threw every logical thought into an attack to provoke her into responding. My heart, a relentless drum in the silence, nearly stopped when I heard her faint whisper in the depths of my mind, "I'm sorry." The voice thrummed with sadness, a child's voice tangled in ages of sorrow. Sleep-deprived and fraught, I grew withdrawn, hardly speaking to Mike as he chattered away in oblivion about weekend plans and office banter. The apparition's presence began to affect my dreams, descending like a fog over my nights. In them, I was always searching, barefoot and alone through twilight woods. She was there, ahead of me, just beyond reach, whispering fragments of sentences that dissolved before I could grasp their meaning. Desperate, I sought the Help of a local psychic who came highly recommended. Within moments of entering the house, she shivered, confirming some presence lingered with us. With caution, she performed rituals, burning sage and murmuring incantations. We watched, hope flickering in the acrid smoke, yearning for liberation, but the girl remained, untouched and unchanged by the psychic's ministrations. As nights bled into weeks, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article while cleaning the attic. Dated over 50 years ago, it told the story of a girl, a child who vanished without a trace from our very neighborhood, her final sighting painfully aligned with the end of our driveway. Goosebumps seared my skin as her fate unfolded, an unsolved mystery entombed in the passage of time. Her name was Lucy Carver. That night, knowing her name made the encounter even more poignant. Her eyes, wide and mournful, begged for something, understanding, maybe, or a release. I no longer displayed the bravado as in weeks past. "Lucy," I whispered, cradling the thought like a fragile secret, "how can I help you?" The reply softened through the rustling leaves, "Find me." Though the town had long forgotten her name, the search for her remains consumed me. Historical Society records suggested she might have been buried in the woods by a deranged neighbor, but no evidence had ever verified the claims. My determination to free her spirit saw me embarking on quests into those woods, the tranquil beauty masking an ominous undercurrent. Over time, I enlisted the help of a local historian and true crime enthusiast named Kevin who'd long harbored interest in Lucy's case. With his help, we conducted metal detection sweeps and cross-referenced every mustard-creased file we could access. One evening, just as exhaustion knotted my resolve, we stumbled upon something in a sun-dappled clearing. What we unearthed was heartbreakingly sparse: fragments of a small shoe, the buckle rust-encrusted, and bits of decayed fabric. As the realization sank in, a profound calm settled over the woods, the air lighter, as if the forest itself exhaled a breath held for far too long. That night, she didn't appear on the stoop. The minutes, then hours, passed, and the space remained undisturbed, a void where her presence once lingered. Finally, sleep fell into me like gentle rain, and for the first time in weeks, my dreams were my own. Lucy was free. There was, however, an unexpected aftermath. News of our discovery rekindled interest in unsolved mysteries throughout the town. While many hailed us as community heroes, the curiosity and whispers surrounding our involvement rarely diminished. The intense attention stirred fresh anxieties. Long after the story's spark dimmed for the townsfolk and Mike returned to his oblivious normalcy, I sensed an enduring vigilance within me. Even now, every so often as night deepens and silence claims the corridors of our home, I listen for the hint of footsteps, wondering if some secrets are ever truly buried, or merely waiting to surface from the shadows of the past. It started out as a simple family camping trip. We thought it'd be a perfect way to bond, get away from the daily grind, and reconnect with nature. My parents, brother, and I packed our gear and drove out to a remote area in the woods, far from cell service, where no one could bother us. The sun was setting when we arrived, casting a golden light through the trees that felt almost magical. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and soon had a crackling fire beneath the darkening sky, sharing stories and laughter that echoed among the trees. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted. My brother, Tommy, who was 12 and always a bit too curious, wandered off with his flashlight to explore a nearby thicket, promising he'd be back in 10 minutes. After 30 minutes of growing concern, my parents sent me to fetch him, their unease palpable. The woods felt different, dense and almost alive, and the air was thick with a silence that made my skin prickle. I called for him, but only the rustle of leaves in the wind replied, and just when I began to feel panic creeping in, I heard a faint, almost playful giggle. It was Tommy's laugh, but it sounded wrong, distorted. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, my heart pounding with every step as I pushed through branches and brambles, the light from my flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, and there was Tommy, surrounded by what I can only describe as a group of figures, tall, thin, and elongated, their limbs almost skeletal. They danced in an unnatural rhythm, their heads tilting at odd angles, as if they were enjoying some twisted game. My heart dropped as realization hit. These weren't just people, they were something else entirely, and they had my brother. I called out to him, but his gaze was fixed on them, entranced, as they beckoned him with long fingers. Terrified, I turned to run back to camp, but one of them lunged at me, its face a horrific blend of human and something primal, with eyes that glowed like embers. I sprinted through the trees, branches snagging my clothes and scratching my skin, until I reached the tent, breathless and trembling. My parents were frantic, and when I told them what I'd seen, They exchanged worried glances, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They'd always told me that my imagination was too wild. As night deepened, I tried to convince them to leave, but they insisted on staying, saying it was just the wilderness playing tricks on me. That was when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter, echoing through the woods. It chilled my bones, and I huddled inside my sleeping bag, listening as the laughter grew louder, mingled with the sounds of footsteps circling our tent. My parents then heard it too, and when they peeked outside, the worry on their faces turned to stark terror. There, standing just beyond the firelight, were those gaunt figures again, and they were staring at us. Mouths twisted into smiles that were far too wide. "It's time to play," one of them called, a voice like dry leaves rustling. My father, gripping a flashlight, shouted for them to leave us alone, but they merely giggled, their eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. Suddenly, the inadequacy of our situation hit us. We were prey in their game. In a panic, my parents grabbed our gear, and we fled into the woods, but it felt like the darkness was alive around us, closing in with every step we took. We sprinted, branching light phantoms from our flashlights illuminating our path, but there were branches and shadows that seemed to whisper as we passed, urging us to stop and join the twisted game. I lost sight of my brother amidst the chaotic retreat, the scramble of feet echoing off the trees, and I shouted for him, my voice raw with fear. I could hear those mocking giggles every time I called, growing closer and closer until they finally stopped. The laughter quieted, and, for a moment, the world was eerily still. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My mother insisted on retracing our steps, but the trees felt foreign now, the path we'd taken slithering in and out like a serpent. We came across an old, decrepit cabin nestled among the trees, its windows dark like empty sockets. Desperation drove us inside, hoping to hide from whatever was outside. It smelled of decay and something far worse, a stench that clawed at our throats. We barricaded the door with whatever we could find, an old table, a broken chair, and huddled together in a corner, our breaths shallow and frantic. Hours passed, and just when we began to lose hope, the daylight finally seeped in, painting the room in a pale light. The laughter had faded, but dread still clung to us like shadow. Gathering our courage, we pushed open the door and stepped outside, ready to find Tommy and make our escape. The forest was completely transformed in the morning light, but something felt off. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness. We followed the path we had fled, the silence amplifying the pounding of our hearts. That's when I saw it, a smear of red against the otherwise pale ground, leading off the path. I thought it was just my imagination, but the closer we got, the clearer it became. It was Tommy's backpack. My mother's face drained of color as she grabbed my father's arm, pointing at the backpack discarded haphazardly, and the realization surged through us. It was a trap, a lure. I felt the breath catch in my throat. We shouted for him again, my scream swallowed by the gnarled embrace of the trees. The laughter returned, swirling around us, taunting us from the shadows as if it were a living thing. Suddenly, the figures appeared again from behind the trees, their forms melding together like a dark ink stain on the bright morning. They moved closer, those grinning faces now closer than ever, and I knew we were too late. We were now part of their hunt, and as they surrounded us, I realized we weren't on a family camping trip anymore. We were the quarry in a horrific game that would never end. The last thing I remember was hearing the sound of laughter, echoing in the distance, as I was pulled into the darkness, my voice lost in the woods, forever. When my mother passed away last year, I was left with a mix of grief and an unsettling responsibility to manage her estate, not just for myself but also for my younger brother, Danny, who had always been the favored child. He was charming, carefree, and had a tendency to flit in and out of trouble, while I was the reliable one, the adult who took care of everything. As the funeral came to a close, my mind was still a whirlpool of emotions, and when it came time to sort through Mom's belongings, I dreaded facing the inevitable conflicts that would arise, especially concerning her wedding ring, a shimmering gold band with an intricate floral design that my dad had given her decades ago. That ring meant the world to me. It was a symbol of their everlasting love, something I wanted to keep close forever, but I sensed the tension brewing when Danny suddenly expressed his desire for it, as if it were just another trinket he could claim, his voice filled with a mix of anger and entitlement. Mom would have wanted me to have it. My stomach twisted. It felt like a betrayal, not just to me but to Mom's memory, and despite his insistence, I stood my ground, opting to keep the ring for myself as a way of honoring the legacy she left behind. Danny erupted into a fit of rage, hurling insults about how selfish I was being, how I never shared anything, while I couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in his tone. a hint of desperation lacing his words as if the ring were a lifeline to him, and I wondered if it was truly about the ring or something else entirely, something buried deep within his psyche. The days turned to weeks, and with them came a series of sleepless nights plagued by nightmares of my mother's last moments, her eyes searching for something that I could never give her back. I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that radiated from Danny's cold sidelong glances and pointed remarks, taunting me as I held on, including notably threatening, "I can always take it, you know," and a chilling unease began to seat itself in the back of my mind. My heart shudders looking back on that time, desperate to cling to the memories of my mother while struggling to maintain my sanity as the weeks turned into a month, which culminated in Danny showing up unannounced one evening, a manic determination glinting in his eyes as he insisted I wasn't being fair. "You just hoard it as a trophy," he shouted, his voice hemmed with an unsettling edge. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air crackling with the tension I could almost taste. Was I really the one being selfish here? And for a moment, I could almost hear my mother, her laughter echoing in my mind as if imploring me to forgive him, forgetting for a heartbeat that I was the one clinging to that last precious piece of her. But I forced myself to look Danny squarely in the eyes. "That ring is all the warmth I have left of her," I spat. The harshness of my words hung heavily in the air, his expression contorted as he recoiled, and, in that moment, I saw confusion mixed with pain, and it suddenly dawned on me, while I sat there, still clutching the ring around my neck, I had sparked something deeper within him, a rift that went far beyond material possessions. Too late, they say, you figure out the true price of love, and days turned into a cycle of cold silences and distant avoidance, the chasm between us growing deeper until finally, in an act of desperation, I decided to visit the cemetery where we buried Mom to seek some semblance of solace. But I wasn't alone. Danny showed up behind me, and for a moment, we stood side by side, exchanging only fleeting glances at the granite tombstone that held our mother's name. The atmosphere was thick with unsaid words and unresolved issues, and before I could utter a word, he blurted, "I want you to know that I need it," and my heart seized. The finality of it all crashed like roaring waves into the shore of my resolve. But it was then, a surge of deep-rooted anguish and insecurity within him that I had dismissed in my stubbornness, to see him unprogrammed, stripped of bravado as raw vulnerability seeped through. Perhaps it wasn't just a ring at all, it was a connection to the mother I feared I was also losing to time. The only connection he felt was left to her, so instead of hatred, I felt a swell of compassion and understanding, finally realizing I had pushed him so far away I could no longer see the brother I had once cherished. "Maybe," I said slowly, my voice soft, "maybe we can share it instead?" The words hung in the air, a lightness creeping into the gravity of the moment, and as I turned to face him fully and saw tears spilling from his eyes, I knew that true healing wouldn't stem from the animosity I had built but from redefining what it meant to carry our mother's legacy together. And so, we stood side by side, unified in grief but reaching for that glimmer of love in the dark, my mother's memory binding us, the weight of her wedding ring heavier than I could ever imagine, finally learning that sometimes, being a brother is knowing when to share what truly matters. It started with a sneeze, a soft, delicate sound that echoed through our dimly lit living room and sent a shiver of worry down my spine. My wife, Clara, was always the picture of health, her bright eyes and infectious laughter lighting up the dreariest of days, but now, as she curled up on the couch, wrapped in layers of blankets, I knew something was off. I chalked it up to an ordinary cold at first, a mere seasonal bug, but the days passed and her symptoms blossomed into something much darker. Her once warm skin felt cold to the touch, her laughter was replaced by the rasp of her throat struggling to draw breath, and soon, deep-set shadows crept under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion far beyond any illness. I tried to care for her, brewing herbal teas, consulting internet remedies, but nothing I did seemed to help. She wasn't improving, just escalating into a state that both horrified and intrigued me. Then, late one night, I awoke to the sound of whispering, soft and dissonant, like wind chimes clashing in a storm, and there she was, sitting up, blank-eyed and feverishly pale, muttering unintelligible phrases that soured the air, sending a chill creeping down my spine. When I called her name, her head snapped towards me, and for just a brief moment, I saw something in her gaze that sent ice pouring through my veins. It wasn't Clara. It was as though something had taken residence in her mind, vast and unknowable, like a dark ocean beneath her once vibrant surface. I made excuses, told myself we'd visit a doctor soon, but every time I tried to call anyone, family, friends, even 911, my phone would die inexplicably, no matter how fully charged, and soon, the silence of our home morphed into something suffocating as each tick of the clock echoed like a countdown, taking away my courage. Then, one evening, as the sunset bled shades of crimson across the sky, Clara, This husk of my wife, suddenly stood, a slow deliberate movement as if guided by strings, and her voice, low and melodic, spoke, except it wasn't quite her voice. It was layered, echoing, and inhuman. "I am the chrysalis that consumes the warmth of the living," it said, each word dripping with an alien menace that made my hair stand on end, and before I could muster the strength to respond, she drifted toward the window, staring out into the gathering darkness with a longing that felt visceral, like she were waiting for something that I had no power to stop. Desperation clawed at my throat as I pulled her back, and in a frantic attempt to shake her from this strange trance, I yelled for her to come back to me, but as I looked into her eyes, so far away in the depths, I understood that she was already lost to me, as if a heavy fog had rolled in and carried her away to some bleak corner of reality that I could never tread. For the next few days, I fought against reality itself, hoarding candles and food in a desperate attempt to stay present, convinced I could claw her back from whatever abyss she slipped into, but it felt futile as I watched the figure in my home become even more ethereal, her movements fluid, almost dreamlike, wandering like a specter through our existence. Then the nightmares began, my nights filled with grotesque images of Clara standing in a field of bones, her figure towering above, her voice ringing like a chorus of lost souls, low and haunting, calling me to join her in this nightmare that stretched into infinity. Day by day, she looked less and less human, her skin taking on a thin, almost translucent quality, and one morning, I awoke to find her slumped over at the kitchen table, face ashen and mouth agape, but my horror peaked when I realized she was no longer breathing. Panic surged as I rushed to her side, shaking her, slapping her cheeks, begging the woman I loved to return, but there was no spark of life behind those closed eyes. It was as though she had become yet another vessel for that unfathomable darkness, and just when I thought I might have to face the devastating truth, I noticed something, a faint shimmering light emerging from her open mouth, oscillating like the dying echo of a heartbeat. I stepped back, heart thudding, as the glow pulsated and morphed into a shape, a ghastly, twisted form that flickered like a flame before it took flight, swirling toward the ceiling and hovering there, undulating as if trying to form a shape in the air, and in some hypnotic way, it seemed to pull me closer. I could feel every instinct telling me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an urge to understand, to watch as this fleeting essence danced above me, a curious blend of shadow and light that pulsated in a way that was both inviting and terrifying. Then, in a moment of violent clarity, I lunged toward her, that dark corruption now twisting and contorting in the air, pulling at the very essence of Clara that remained, desperate to reclaim what was lost, but as I reached, the light flickered, dissipating like smoke, and vanished. My hands fell to my side, the air heavy with the unexplainable absence, and suddenly her eyes snapped back open, the chilling void now replaced with clarity, yet something was still terribly wrong. Her smile was bright, yet her voice was laced with an eerie calmness. "Don't worry, love, I'm fine now," she said, but I could see the truth lurking within, the faintest glimpse of that other presence behind her eyes, and it ignited a primal fear in my chest. I wanted to scream, to confess that I knew she was gone, replaced by something that would never love me back, but instead, I forced a smile and nodded, trapped in the nightmare I never consented to. "I'm glad you're back," I murmured, unaware that the darkness had wrapped itself around my heart, that I had become the next sacrifice in a game much larger than I could ever comprehend, chained to this specter that wore my wife's familiar face, a living echo of a memory that would never return, and as she reached for me, I realized the whispers had returned, promising endless warmth and dark delights, and I couldn't shake the dawning horror. I was not just losing Clara, I was beginning to understand that I had become part of her cold embrace, drawn into that consuming chrysalis that would never let me go. When my sister Lori initially announced her intent to skip my wedding because of a scheduling conflict, I knew it wasn't true. The conflict was always deeper than a busy planner, it was the festering wound of family drama that began with our mother's death. Lori found solace in a bottle afterward, a coping mechanism that spiraled into a severe drinking problem. For years, I tried to help her, offered her countless lifelines, but she always slipped back into the abyss with every chance I gave. So, when I found love with Eric and we planned our small, intimate ceremony, I hoped Lori might finally pull herself together, if only for one day, but her RSVP arrived with a scrawled-out "sorry, can't make it." Part of me was relieved. She had cocaine-catalyzed chaos at my previous birthdays, every memory etched with her shrieks and broken vases. Still, I didn't have the heart to cut her out completely because she was my sister, my blood. But then came the phone call late one night. Eric's car had collided with another, a drunk driver, and I spent the night in the bubbling hysteria of the emergency room. Through masked voices and sterile shadows, I kept thinking of how it could have been Lori behind the wheel, and a snarling resentment stirred in me. The driver turned out to be someone else, a nobody whose fate we couldn't share solace in knowing or abhorring personally, yet it didn't stop the carnage of that night. Eric survived, but with scars and a limp that would be forever reminders of that turmoil, and as those weeks blurred, so did any coherent thought on weddings or celebrations. When I finally spoke to Lori, her slurring voice on the other end was staring at my patience. "I'll try to come," she mumbled, the reluctance like nails against glass, scraping away the last pretense of hope for a normal celebration. I told her not to bother, that I didn't want any more chaos, cops, or hospital rooms because my patience had worn thin. This seemed to jar her momentarily, a stunned silence hanging between us like the specter of who we once were to each other. I truly wanted to believe this was her wake-up call, but I woke the next morning to find half-blurry, threatening texts between us from the prior drunken night on her end, a cocktail of guilt and anger gripping me. I never imagined I would forever sever that fragile sibling tie, yet my heart steeled itself for what was necessary, snipping the last strings, until she showed up anyway, uninvited, on my wedding day, standing in the aisle reeking of perfume and vodka. She was a train wreck marinating in desperation, swaying as she made a scene and spotlight steal the happiness I'd gathered in my marrow for that day. There was shouting, confusion, and in the rawness of it all, a disharmony twinkled in my heart. Was she the monster, or was I, to have my life motioned to a solitary piece that had no room for her anymore? In the torment of my decision, I watched security escort my sister, my mirror, and wondered if family ties meant anything if they are spliced and withered by addiction. The night concluded with candles flickering onto tablecloths in the reception hall, the guests tiptoeing around the elephant of the deed, a sister crushed and tumbling away into the night. While I clutched Eric's unblemished hand, now coupled with history and hesitant happiness, guilt slithered through, whispering untold tales of blood pacts and broken promises. It all seemed an endless echo of a story, one riddled with unsolvable threads of guilt and anger, and in those weeks to come, no redemptive climax ever arrived, just the murmurings of a conscience uncertain if this sacrifice was liberation or an eternal weight on my fractured heart. I've seen some weird stuff in the woods, and if you don't believe me, you should probably stop reading now because I can't rest until I share this with someone, anyone, who might understand. It all started when my friends and I decided to venture into the thick, tangled woods at the edge of our town, a place we were told to avoid but felt the urge to explore. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting shadows that seemed to twist and creep along the ground, and by the time we set up our campsite, we could hear the distant, eerie rustling, a sound that didn't seem quite natural. It was then, as we huddled around the fire, that things began to take a turn for the bizarre. Tony had been the first to notice the eyes, glowing, yellow orbs staring at us from the darkness just beyond the reach of our flickering campfire. He tried to laugh it off, but the unease settled over us like a fake fog. The woods felt alive that night, the branches whispering secrets in the wind, but we were far too engrossed in our ghost stories to think much of it until the fire popped loudly, revealing a fleeting silhouette darting between the trees. We convinced ourselves it was just a deer or maybe a trick of light, but when the air grew silent and the shadows shifted unnaturally, panic began to creep in. We decided to check out the source of the disturbance, our flashlights piercing the darkness as we marched deeper into the woods, our bravado waning with every step. The deeper we went, the more I felt an invisible presence looming, shadowing our every move, and just when we thought we'd discover the cause of our fear, we stumbled upon something that froze us in place, a makeshift shrine formed of twigs, animal bones, and what looked like small, weather dolls crafted from moss and twine. Panic overtook us, and when we turned to leave, we were met with a sickening crunch underfoot, as if we had disturbed something ancient and powerful. The woods had changed, the path behind us seemed to twist and turn improbably, leading to places we couldn't recognize, and with each step, the night grew deeper, chillier, and we began to hear whispers, a low, relentless murmuring vibrating through the trees, chanting something unintelligible yet undeniably laced with dread. In that unsettling moment, I felt unbidden pressure on my chest as though unseen hands were forcing the air from my lungs. I glanced back at my friends, but they had transformed, their faces pale, gaunt, marked with an expression I can only describe as otherworldly, and before I could open my mouth to speak, they were gone, vanished into the night like smoke, leaving me utterly alone. It was quiet then, too quiet, aside from the rustle of leaves, and I began sprinting in what I hoped was the direction of safety, but with every stride, the ground felt softer, almost gelatinous, like it was swallowing me whole. I remember hearing my name faintly called, a voice mingled with the haunting whispers echoing in the dark, drawing me towards something that looked like a figure, but as I neared it, the shape dissolved into shadows, laughter mingled with the trees, and I was left feeling like a fool chasing an illusion. The night aged painfully as I stumbled through the oppressive darkness, memories of my friends' terrified faces haunting me until I finally spotted the moon through the shimmering canopy, a miraculous beacon of light. I thought I could find them again, that we might break this terrible spell, but the woods had other plans. I blinked in confusion as a thick fog rolled in, choking the light and rearranging the silhouettes of the trees around me, creating hallways of horrors that seemed to lead nowhere. The voices grew louder, soon accompanied by a chorus of giggles that sounded like children playing, except this wasn't a game, and I was no longer part of their world. With desperation urging me forward, I stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight pouring in like a spotlight, revealing more of those grotesque dolls adorning the gnarled branches. It was then that I noticed the faces of my friends staring back at me, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths locked in silent screams. My heart raced as I realized they were no longer alive but rather part of the twisted frolic the woods engaged in. Their forms were marionettes held aloft by strings made of fog and shadow, their bodies barely recognizable, and as I stepped backward in horror, my foot snagged on something hard. Another bone, I thought, but now I could feel it pulsating, alive and seeking, and as I looked down, I was scanned by the very same eyes I had seen before. I could feel myself being pulled into the forest's whispers, feeling the cold breath of 1,000 lost souls drawing me in, and in that moment, I understood the chilling truth: the woods didn't just keep secrets, they took you as their own. Something cold and insatiable gripped my heart as the moonlight dimmed, and in the darkness, the last thing I remember is the echoes of my own screams mingling with the laughter of something ancient, something waiting for its next plaything, ensnared forever in the grip of the woods, just like them, just like me. And now I find myself wondering if this is my existence endlessly, a puppet in this nightmare, forever repeating the tale of those who wrongly ventured into the shadows. So if you ever wander into the woods, remember this: what you think you see in the dark, what you hear echoing through the trees, might not be a figment of your imagination but an invitation, an offer to join the ranks of those who've come before, and if you're not careful, you might just become part of the forest's legacy, whispering your warnings to the next unsuspecting souls who dare to tread where they should not. When I was 7, my older sister, Elara, showed me the first of many dark and inexplicable cruelties she would inflict upon me. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when she beckoned me into the cramped, dusty attic, her voice a sweet melody concealing venom. The moment I crossed the threshold, she shut the creaky wooden door behind us, plunging the room into an eerie dimness save for a narrow shaft of light piercing through a tiny window. Her smile was something I'd grown wary of, too wide, too bright, as if her joy fed on my discomfort. In her hand, unusually pale in the subdued light, she held a small, mushy bird, its lifeless body dangling limply. "Look what I've found," she cooed, her fingers flexing around its small frame, and I realized with a shiver that she intended me to feel its brittleness, its stillness. That was the genesis of my secret. Over the years, she became adroit at tormenting me with twisted games and errands, whispering threats I didn't fully comprehend but feared deeply enough to obey. At school, to everyone else, she was the accomplished elder sibling, the epitome of academic brilliance and extracurricular allure. At home, she was a ghost haunting my aspirations for normalcy, a predator stalking the shadows of my childhood. When I approached our parents, their belief in Elara's saintly disposition eclipsed my plea. The sharp rebuke in their eyes sent me spiraling into silence, reaffirming my position as a fluctuating variable in Elara's sadistic calculus. As the years blurred, routine encounters at home, innocuous to the unseeing, transformed into strategic ambushes, meticulously orchestrated scenarios intended to belittle, erode, seize power over me. Tripping me discreetly when relatives were over, sowing doubt in teachers' minds with those meticulous tales spun with calculated precision, each act was a ritual dissection of my spirit. Her psychological shackles tightened when she subtly started manipulating my friendships, sowing discord with an artfulness that bewildered and bruised my sense of belonging. Yet, recounting these tales, I remind myself that it was the dinner party 5 years ago, a famous crux point, that undid me. Elara, now thriving in her respectability, had gathered the family, her friends, colleagues, peacocking before them while I merely hovered by the fringes, a peripheral shadow in her well-lit world. That night, within the falsely jovial confines of our dining room, something snapped. I don't quite recall what prompted the exchange, perhaps it was the wine, or the sheer weight of her blithe omnipresence that had me confronting her. Words tumbled out, a torrent of repressed confessions, her malice, her despotism, my silent suffering, all threadbare and exposed. The room shifted uneasily, and in that spotlight, Alara's charm faltered for just a fraction of a heartbeat, a flicker of the truth. I had expected vindication, a collective understanding, yet was met with the cold eye glare of collective disbelief and suspicion. Alara, ever the master of manipulation, rode the storm with tears, ingeniously turning the tables, fashioning my breakdown as an unfortunate, unprovoked outburst. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, a melodrama of concern, with tender reassurances muting any residual doubts among our guests. For every scream for help paralyzed behind my lips, Alara had a ready, meticulously curated counter-narrative. The psychology of her tactics lay in their cunning simplicity, like a stealthy poison administered drop by drop, killing not the body but the spirit. Retreating into the folds of apology, feigned smiles stitched up my lips, grim acceptance blanketed my logic. Alone with my thoughts once more, my reality twisted inward, curled around my heart, a silent resentment I dare not nourish lest I implode. Yet tonight, a decade past that pivotal night, the shadows she's laying are no longer my shackles but my stepping stones. It started with a simple journal. Idle scrawling thoughts expanded into conversations with those tethered to their own tales of malice and oddity. Strangers became allies, my whispered truths echoed in other unheard voices across boards, stories like pebbles cascading into the vast ocean of shared understanding. The irony hasn't escaped me, perhaps Alara's inadvertently given me clarity, gifting me insight into the minds of those who bask in darkness. The shadow of her legacy remains, echoing in the spaces between memory and reality as I pen these words. Not for justice or vengeance, these are aspirations for the unwounded, but for delineation, for acceptance of the void she created. So, when you ask why my sister abused me, the only solace I find nestles in the ambiguity of human capacity, beyond comprehension, beyond justification, an enigma I've learned to unravel, paradoxically, while bound tightly within its snares. Having grown up reading myth asshole threads religiously, I never thought I'd have a personal story that would fit the bizarre mix of family drama and ghostly horror they often entailed. Yet here I am, feeling the very texture of Reddit threads scrolling beneath my fingertips as I recount the unsettling week I had with my sister-in-law, Jenna, who seemed oblivious to the spectral nature of her claims on a house that was never truly hers in the eyes of the living or the dead. For context, our father-in-law, Gary, was an eccentric man known for his peculiar lifestyle choices, but if there was one thing he was clear about, it was that his small, cobblestone-laden property situated on the edge of a forgotten forest was to remain unclaimed until his departure being the word he specifically used instead of death. Gary's will explicitly stated that his house would be sold, and the proceeds donated to his favorite cryptozoology society, much to the chagrin of Jenna, who somehow convinced herself that she was entitled to the property as some form of inheritance, based on what she described as silent promises whispered to her by the house itself. I didn't think much of it at first. Jenna always had a flair for the dramatic, claiming to have spiritually connected with the souls of our ancestors each Halloween, complete with sage burning and interpretative dances in the family living room. However, it was the day after Gary's passing that things spiraled from inconvenient entitlement to supernatural dread. Jenna insisted on staying the night in the old house, determined to confront Gary's spirit and coax him into granting her claims, while we all thought she was simply grief-stricken and beyond rationality. My husband, Gary's only son, and I hesitantly agreed, more out of exhaustion than compliance, thinking she'd soon enough hit the walls of reality and relent. It wasn't until midnight, when the air felt thick with something unsaid, that the phone rang, the kind of ringing that cuts through the bone, vibrating with a sense of urgency uncommon for such an hour. Jenna's voice was barely a whisper, yet jagged and cut through with fear, urging us to come to the house immediately because they had decided to convene. Who was they, you might ask? Conveyed in hushed, half-sobbed tones, Jenna described the dark silhouettes forming out of nothingness in the shadowed recesses of each room within the house, shadows that stretched and morphed into people, old and newer ancestors of the family, she claimed, though there was something inherently wrong with their transient forms, as if they slithered under their skin rather than truly inhabited it. Panic-stricken but skeptical, we made our way through the murky, windswept roads leading to Gary's estate, guided not by belief but by sheer concern for Jenna's mental well-being, or so we thought. As we pulled up the driveway, the sight of the house sent a chill down our spines, the windows, riddled with frost in the middle of August, seemed to weep a silvery residue like tears frozen in time. The once homey structure now loomed as a spectral sentinel of secrets we weren't meant to uncover. Inside, Jenna sat cross-legged on the dusty wooden floor of the foyer, her eyes transfixed by the gathering of faint, contorted figures framing the dim candlelight she had strewn around the room in a desperate attempt at illumination. What do you do in such a bizarre situation? Laugh it off as one of Jenna's theatrical outbursts, or engage with the haunting at hand? Out of respect for the uncanny, we chose the latter. "Jenna, let's go," I said, gripping the cold banister as I attempted to help her up, but she resisted, insisting that they had yet to deliver their judgment. And there it was, the murmur of disembodied voices, a chorus of guilty whispers reverberating from the very walls themselves, each distinct yet incomprehensible, merging into a cacophony of chaos that threatened to unravel my understanding of reality. Among the rabble, a singular voice emerged with clarity. Gary's. He rebuked Jenna's claims, his ethereal sentence dripping with a mixture of amusement and sorrow, eerily amused at Jenna's audacity to leverage a material gain against an ancestral vow of mystery. "The house," he said, voice echoing through the wiring and wood, "belongs only to the secrets it keeps and the stories it whispers into the void." In that moment, the shadows surged forward as one, a rushing tide of ancient grief and potent justice, and I realized the truth, that the house was claiming Jenna, mind and soul, merging tradition and treachery into a living lesson for those who dared to misunderstand, forever inscribing our family's follies into its foundation. A battle of heart ensued, our voices joining to pull Jenna back from the abyss Gary's house had become, to wrench her free from the grasp of ancestral debt she should never have dared to shoulder. With one desperate final pull, her eyes snapped open, cleared of the haunted haze, as she stumbled back to us, stunned, silent, and suddenly burdened with the realization of how narrowly she had skirted the edge of her own unraveling. The figures dissipated, leaving only the chilling echo of Gary's laughter in their wake, a reminder that some inheritances are better left unclaimed. Since that night, Jenna has never mentioned the house, save for its fleeting appearance in her dreams, dreamt whispers urging her not toward ownership but understanding. And it seems the house, satisfied with its revelation, has since returned to its dormant vigil, a house that is no longer simply the dwelling of our father-in-law but a keeper of complexities and heartaches, quietly resting on the forest's edge, forever humming its ghostly lullaby. As for me, I'll spare my detailed encounters for future therapy sessions, lest they dig too deeply into the nightmare fabric of Reddit threads yet to be spawned from the depths of imagination or memory, whichever governs the truth. I've always considered myself a skeptic, a firm believer in the rational, the logical, the tangible, but that all changed one dreary evening at O'Malley's, the kind of dive where neon lights flicker like the last breaths of dying stars, and the air is thick with the scent of stale beer and regret. I was nursing a whiskey, watching the drunks shuffle in and out like ghosts wandering between realms, when an unsettling chill crept up my spine, and I glanced to my right. That's when I first saw him, a man in a tailored suit, perfectly pressed as if he had just stepped out of a dream. His skin was pale, almost waxy, his features unnaturally smooth like the face of a mannequin, and yet his eyes, those deep, sunken black holes that seemed to lap at my very soul, held a chilling promise of finality. He lifted his glass, a crystal tumbler filled with something darker than night, and offered a slight, knowing smirk. At that moment, everything around us faded as he leaned in. I could feel my heart race, the familiar tremor of dread rising up my throat. "Finish your drink," he said casually, the words dripping with a predatory calmness that sent shivers down my spine. "It's time to go." For a second, my mind whirled, torn between disbelief and the very primal fear that makes us human. I managed a laugh that sounded forced even to my ears, a desperate attempt to mask the cold pit of anxiety in my stomach. "What do you mean, time to go?" I asked, wanting nothing more than to escape this choking atmosphere, yet my curiosity sprawled wide open, craving answers. He didn't respond right away, and in that silence, I became aware of the other patrons, the crying woman at the end of the bar, the man downing shots like they were breaths of air, all seemingly oblivious to the magnetic presence hovering beside me. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the glass as if it were my lifeline, and pushed on. "Who are you?" He chuckled, a low, gravelly sound layered with disdain, revealing that he knew more about me than I cared to admit, that he knew my fears, my failures, the very things that haunted my dreams. "Let's just say I'm your final invitation to a journey you've tried to escape for too long." A shudder coursed through me, and with each word he spoke, I felt my grip on reality begin to slip like sand in an hourglass. "I don't have time for this," I said, my voice wavering under the weight of his gaze. "You're probably just some dude playing a prank, or maybe you need a drink." But deep down, I knew he wasn't just a man, he embodied something far more sinister, the inevitable end that we all try to ignore. He leaned closer, the air growing thick and unnatural, and whispered, "Tell me, what would you say to death if it asked you to come home?" The question hung in the air, suffocating the laughter and the clinking of glasses, and for a moment, I was lost in a whirlwind of thoughts. Would I fight? Would I plead? The faces of the people I loved flashed before my eyes, and the regret gnawed at my heart like a starving wolf. I don't want to go, I stammered finally, desperate words escaping my lips as if sealing a bargain between us. He smiled then, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and I felt the world shake around me as shadows flickered at the edges of my vision like flames within a raging storm. You think you have a choice? Every drink brings you closer, every hour a step on the path you're too afraid to traverse. I'm merely here to guide you there. Panic surged in my veins. No, I can't. I looked around wildly, but the bar was emptying, people shuffling away as if taking their leave before the storm. I felt trapped in a glass cage, his pale hand resting nonchalantly on the bar, the dark liquid in his glass swirling dangerously. Finish your drink, he repeated, the words now dripping with menace, compelling me to heed his command. In that instant, I was struck with the strangest feeling. Every sip of my whiskey felt like an illicit tasting of my own mortality, the warmth turning cold, blue starlight glimmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just a drink, it was a tribute to the things I'd done, the choices I'd made, and threads of fate that were tightening around my throat. Why can't you just let me be? I shouted over the emptiness. My heart pounded in my chest. Moments before it seemed the air itself recoiled around us, giving weight to his nonchalant demeanor. He raised an eyebrow, seeming amused. You think standing still can protect you? It only means you're trapped in a web, waiting for the moment of your own unraveling. His voice turned softer, laden with an otherworldly warmth that felt both inviting and terrifying. People think they can ignore me, pretend I don't exist. But I'm there in the back of their minds, the whisper that tells them they're running out of time. And when their glass is empty, they realize. He trailed off, watching me closely as I stared into my drink, the liquid barely touched. Finish your drink, and maybe I'll let you off easy. I felt as if I were choking on life itself, my throat tight as memories surged, laughter of friends and family echoing hauntingly. What if this was it? What if I had only this last chance to grapple with my own demise? I am a coward, I'd always been. Compulsion stirred within me, a painful yearning. What if I don't? I asked, weak yet defiant, bracing myself against the tide of inevitable despair. His amusement faded, and in its wake came a chilling stillness that spoke of ancient truths, of shadows lurking just out of reach, waiting for the world to dim its glow. Then the next glass you pour will be for someone else, and trust me, it'll be no less dark. The darkness enveloping me thickened, resonating with unspeakable knowledge, spinning tales of souls long gone, people who danced with their demise at the bar outside of time. I watched him, feeling the breath catch in my throat as I remembered every moment I'd taken for granted, every breath wasted, and my heart constricted tight until I heard my own voice whisper, "What happens if I do?" The silence stretched like an abyss, and then he smiled wider, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too perfect. Then, my friend, we dance. And with those words, I found myself standing, the glass trembling in my hand as I raised it to my lips, the whiskey burning like a comet as it slipped down my throat. The room spun, colors warped into iridescent patterns of a dying sun, and I felt every heartbeat, every drop of the past crashing down upon me in waves of fear. I had expected despair but felt something strange, a flicker of peace and surrender, an embrace of inevitability that danced in the air around us. I looked into his eyes, the eternal void staring back, my pulse racing as I took the final gulp and let the glass clatter against the bar. "All right, let's go," I said, each word pulling me deeper into my own shadow, and he stood, his presence towering over me, as he reached out his hand, cool and inviting. The threshold was near, the veil drawn back, and I was ready. But there, within that moment, I felt a surge, a refusal to succumb without a fight. "No," I cried, wrestling against the weight of fate bearing down on me. The dregs of the whiskey surged in a rush of defiance, igniting a fire deep within me, flaring against the cold grasp of despair and illuminating my thoughts. Maybe I'll stay a little longer, I thought, wrestling with the tendrils of his shadow wrapping around my mind. Maybe next time, death. I'm not ready to go just yet. An eruption of laughter filled the air, bellowing from deep within him, reverberating off the empty walls. Run, hide, linger. The choice is yours, but know this, I am always nearby, a drink waiting in the dark. Until then, enjoy your revelry. And just like that, he stepped back into the shadows, his figure evaporating into the chaos of the night as the bar came alive again around me, and I sat there, breathing heavily as if awakening from a nightmare, the last traces of whiskey lingering on my lips as if tainted by the very essence of existence itself. In that bar, Under dim lights, I learned that while death may sit beside you, it's not the end you must fear but the moments you forget to cherish along the way. I've always been the person people look at and think has it all together. I guess that's why it feels so strange confessing this here, to faceless strangers, but maybe it's the only way I won't implode. So here it is, I'm incredibly miserable, and I have no one to talk to about it. This isn't how things were supposed to be. I worked my way through college, landed a stable job, and even married my college sweetheart. That was supposed to be the American dream, right? But dreams have a nasty habit of twisting and warping until you don't recognize them, and you're left in a nightmare. Every morning, I walk the halls of the corporate office wearing a mask of competence. I handle mergers and acquisition deals with a smile that could sell a lie as truth. The only ones who see through it are a few disgruntled coworkers, their whispers in the break room sounding like snakes hissing in my ears. She's going places, they say, but it feels like the only place I'm going is further into my own misery. It must have started with the move to the suburbs. Derek, my husband, assured me it was what we needed, a new start, a bigger house, a dog even. The white picket fence was supposed to be our safeguard against the chaos of the city, but all it's really done is isolate me further. Each day, the suburbs grow quieter, more suffocating. Even Derek seems distant, our conversations reduced to exchanges about grocery lists and mortgage payments as if real connection is something we can no longer afford. And the dog, Rufus, bless him, he seems to notice my despondence, his sad eyes following me around the house as if he's the only one who understands. It's funny, isn't it? How the silence becomes so loud. At night, the creaks and groans of our supposedly perfect home whisper secrets I can't unravel. One night, as Derek lay snoring beside me, I started hearing a tapping sound, rhythmically constant, tapping from the walls, the floors, or maybe beneath the bed. It was impossible to pinpoint, maddening like a drip that never ends. Derek claimed he couldn't hear it, accused me of stress or fatigue, said I should see someone about it. Talk to someone, he insisted, pretending to care. But who could I talk to? No one wants to hear the perfect woman, the successful executive, admitting that maybe she's on the verge of falling apart. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, an old cliché to calm my newly fervent paranoia. But then it got worse. The tapping turned to scratching. Soft, insidious scraping noises that burrowed into my head like a bad melody. I attempted to drown it out with headphones, but the air took on an oppressive weight. I swear, some nights I could feel vibrations running through the floorboards like a heartbeat. The rational part of me, what rational part there is left, argued it was mice or some other nuisance, but something deeper inside suggested it was sinister, different. It was during the third week that I found the notes. Small paper, slips, no larger than a fortune cookie message, tucked in random places, under my pillow, slipped into my coat pocket, even once in the pantry between cereal boxes. I see you, they said. It was such a simple message, yet it rattled me to my core. Derek laughed it off when I showed him, accused me of working too hard or even planting them as a cry for help, which made me feel more alone than ever. Was that all this was? A manifestation of my own desperation? But why would I do this to myself? Desperate for some explanation, any release, I started documenting everything. Each scratch, each note, each gut-clenching moment of dread. All neatly typed into a journal on my laptop, a private confession of my unraveling mind. Then one night, the sound led me down into the basement. The scratching was all-consuming there as if it were a beast beneath my skin. Hard hammering, I pried up a loose floorboard only for the sound to stop instantly, leaving an eerie silence that felt like taunting laughter. And that's when I saw it, a small, decrepit box of old off-white letters. Each envelope was marked with frail handwriting unmistakably similar to my own. My hands trembled as I leafed through, recognizing shadowy versions of my biggest insecurities and fears in slanted script. And below all the letters, a worn photograph of a woman who looked like me but different. Her eyes were lifeless, empty. On the back, in that same familiar handwriting, was inscribed, "I've never left." That's when everything clicked, the unwelcome realization slipping through the cracks of my sanity. This wasn't an obsession of a stranger or a sick prank. What I saw in the photograph was myself, a future self perhaps, or a past me newly unearthed. I couldn't breathe. The house, the perfect life, it wasn't a dream. It was a chronic deception tying me to something dark, something buried. Now I understand how misery thrives unseen, sewn into the foundation, subtly driving me to madness. Returning upstairs, I found the journal open, keys creaking under phantom hands, letters typing on their own. I slammed the laptop shut, The echo resonating through the emptiness of the house, the oppressive quiet of suburbia closing in. Derek returned from work, finding me in pieces, claimed he saw nothing on the journal because he couldn't untangle my inserted psyche from reality anymore. Yet his shadow stretched across the room, across the security of our lives, hinting, knowing. Maybe you won't believe my confession. It's easier to dismiss the distressed as delusional. But amongst these hollow walls, I became a silent witness to my own turbulence, reality layered with subtle terrors. And here, sharing with you, faceless souls who might only mock or dismiss me, it feels like a bitter relief. A small, absurd wish lingers that maybe one of you has seen this creature of despair too. Or perhaps we're all unwitting authors lost in our own creeping stories. I never thought I'd cross this line, but desperation and curiosity got the better of me. You see, my friend Alex and I had known each other since college. We were close enough that crashing on each other's couches after a night out was a norm. Alex was always a bit of a tech-savvy guy. He participated in everything from coding hacks to digital art projects. Lately, he'd been working on something secretive, something that had him missing hangouts and only half paying attention during our usual gaming sessions. When I pressed, he'd laugh it off, calling it a passion project he wasn't yet ready to share. But my naturally inquisitive nature wouldn't let it go. It was during one of these nights, Alex passed out on his couch after polishing off an impressive lineup of craft beers, that my chance came. His laptop, which he was always so protective of, lay on the coffee table, its screen just dimmed, not locked. I should have left it, I really should have, especially with the alcohol fogging my judgment. But a nagging voice inside my head convinced me, just take a peek. What harm could it do to browse a bit while he slept so soundly? The curiosity was eating me alive. Feeling the adrenaline spike, I turned his laptop slightly toward me. The desktop was organized, a maze of folders all neatly tagged. But one folder caught my eye, named with an unusual set of characters that seemed out of place, as if hiding something special. I clicked it open, revealing a trove of file names, all dates and cryptic strings. They were images, hundreds of them. At first, I thought it was his digital art portfolio, but as I glimpsed at the previews, I realized this was something else entirely. Private photos, intimate snapshots of people I knew we both interacted with, some I personally recognized, candid and oblivious, completely unaware they were being documented. My heart thundered as realization dawned, these weren't just any photos, they were taken without consent, a secret invasion into the lives of those around him. Fear and guilt crashed over me, yet an irrational competitiveness urged me to click deeper. In some sick way, I told myself I needed proof, and maybe then I'd confront Alex. But as I scrolled, the severity of what I'd done hit harder. I wasn't just a bystander now, I was implicated, complicit in this breach of trust. The uncertainty of whether Alex noticed stung my thoughts, and a plan hatched in the adrenaline-laced cirque of my mind, transfer them onto my USB. Then, I'd have insurance against whatever madness this was. I could wield this as leverage. Maybe Alex needed help, I reasoned, or maybe he was just going off the deep end without realizing it himself. Either way, these photos had to go somewhere safe before he woke. Hastily, I finished the transfer, my hands shook, my conscience screamed, and still, I shoved the flash drive into my pocket like it was burning a hole to freedom. The next morning was blurry, bleary-eyed from half a night's sleep, and a head pounding with regret. Alex awakened, none the wiser to my late-night escapade. Over coffee, he seemed normal, friendly banter resumed, dissolving into typical shared memes and laughable morning chaos. But my perception of him had changed irrevocably. The laughter felt forced, strained under the knowledge that I was sitting across from a stranger with dangerous secrets. What haunted me most was the choice I now bore, confront him and potentially lose a friend, or sit on this dark secret, risking exposure if he found out what I'd done. But as days passed, something shifted in Alex. He grew guarded, as though sensing an invisible rift had spread between us. He stopped inviting me over, our conversations thinned out, faces reduced to avatars in a chat room. Weeks turned to months, and paranoia shadowed my every step. I felt the burn of those illicit files constantly, the USB a cursed artifact hidden at the bottom of a drawer, waiting for its day of reckoning. In restless dreams, Alex knew everything, and confrontation always ended in dread, accusations, friendships shattered, or worse, a sinister, vengeful alter ego that Alex transformed into, ready to pull me under along with his secret. Amidst this chaos, I reached a defining moment. I needed closure. I contacted Alex, masked my nervousness with a light-hearted excuse to reminisce about old times. He agreed, though his voice hinted an undercurrent of unease. We met at a bar we frequented in better times, our chat dense, deliberately trivial. Then I acted. My heart battered against my ribs as I slid the USB across the sticky lacquered table. His eyes darted from mine to the small device, and back, questioning. It was now or never, my confession stumbled out, words tripping over shame, fear, and thiox of remorse. Silence stretched, a pause the length of eternity where his expression was a void. Then, slow recognition anchored his face, his casual demeanor dissolved into something chillingly calculated. "You shouldn't have done that," he said softly, a strange calmness in his voice that frightened me more than shouting ever could. "You don't know what you've interfered with." His cryptic reply swirled into my mind like a dark cloud, and I realized there was much more hidden behind those files than I'd ever imagined. He pocketed the USB, leaving a parting warning that left my veins frozen, a promise of consequences yet unspelled. His calm threat lingered in the air like a toxic mist, and abruptly he was gone, leaving me alone to unravel my own tangled web of guilt and intrusion. The fear still haunts me, knowing the extent of Alex's true nature remains a shadow tale I glimpsed too late. But the tangled knot of what I'd done feels irreversible, a thorn that stays wedged deep in trust and friendship erstwhile lost. I've come to realize it's not just the photos that changed everything, but stepping into a dark tunnel with no end in sight, where friendship might not survive, or worse, where it mutates, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. I never intended to let anyone know about this, fearing ridicule, isolation, or worse, that someone might actually believe me and the implications of that belief, yet here I am, confessing to the anonymous ether of the internet. This is the safest place I can think of for bearing my truth. I genuinely think people can read my mind. It began a few months ago when I noticed subtle shifts in my interactions with people around me. You know that feeling you get when you're being watched, the prickling awareness that someone's gaze is pressing on your skin? Imagine that, but it's not just your skin, it's your thoughts laid bare like pages of an open book. It started small. I'd think of my morning's missing keys, and my roommate would nonchalantly mention where I'd last had them, without me uttering a word. Coincidental, I told myself. But then, at work, I'd draft imaginary conversations, preparing for meetings that hadn't yet been announced, and by afternoon, those very subjects would be brought up as if my colleagues had been privy to the silent rehearsals in my head. One day, midway through an unspoken criticism of my boss's questionable attire, her face flushed, a rare hint of vulnerability, and she glanced at me, just a nanosecond too long, before nervously adjusting her collar. My heart hammered as I began tallying these instances, realizing they were far too frequent to dismiss as mere chance. A chilling realization set in that no environment was safe. My thoughts were dissected and broadcast like a radio signal everyone could tune into. I began testing it intentionally, projecting bizarre and harmless musings towards strangers, like silently screaming the word elephant in a crowded elevator, only for someone to mutter about a safari tour they once took. In another instance, standing behind a couple at a cafe, I fixated on the notion of meteorites, only for them to start a random conversation about outer space. These coincidences piled up into a tower of unsettling evidence. Panic ensued as the phenomenon grew more intrusive. People not only mirrored my thoughts but reacted to them, sometimes violently. One evening, thinking disdainfully about how my neighbor always left their garbage bags along the hallway, I was shocked to see them storm upstairs and shove those same bags into my apartment with furious mutterings about entitled people who act like they can think whatever they want about others. Sleep became a frenzied minefield of restless thoughts bleeding into nightmares where I was hunted, not for crimes committed, but for thoughts unguarded. My once sacred solitude devolved into a fearsome solitude. I tried reaching out to others, testing those I thought close to me to see if anyone would outright acknowledge this nightmare, this thing shared through our unguarded, voiceless dialogues. But attempts to deliberately clear my mind only left me blank as a canvas, for others to picture what they wanted from me. A sinister control fluttered into play, a marionette string subtly tightening. In a grotesque mockery of communication, I'd sense others prodding around in my mind, calmly breaching the vault of what should have been private, nodding in apparent satisfaction as they found and took what was needed for them. I became afraid to think anything, knowing that thinking wasn't mine anymore, forever leashed to a chorus of silent observers. Can you imagine the pure dread of trying to hold secrets so dearly, trying to remember that they too would be found whenever deemed necessary? The silent suggestions lunged through my mind, leaving home, changing names, burying myself in some corner of the world until years blurred by, realizing that thought, too, wasn't just mine. Desperation clawed at my sanity as even the consideration of escape bled through to all too curious minds. People can read my mind, This I know with a certainty that burns and freezes. Please, to any reader who comes across this, who swears this is mere fiction, spare your judgment until you've felt that cold and invasive knowing that you are no longer alone with yourself, not even in the hollows of your cranium. Every laugh that feels too knowing, every shift of an eye, is magnified into evidence that we aren't meant to be solitary creatures. They already know, they will always know, and who hears this confession may someday realize that their safekeeping of thoughts is only an illusion, as flimsy as the trust I had in those around me before the world tilted into this bleak, thought-sharing abyss. Reducing my life to a performance that wasn't asked for, where every critic and confidant remains unseen, touching my deepest fears with the intimacy only thoughts can fathom. I don't know if this is happening to others, if there's a silent epidemic of minds laid bare, judged openly but shadowed by community silence. This is more than paranoia, this is an awareness, haunting and all-consuming, beyond the self, sparking an evolution of fear. My thoughts are no longer mine, and what terrifies me is the thought that neither are yours. It all started when my brother Kevin invited his girlfriend, Sarah, to stay with us for the weekend. I already had reservations about her, she always seemed too perfect, like she was hiding something beneath her meticulously managed facade. But Kevin was smitten, so I held my tongue. On the first night, Sarah offered to cook dinner. As she moved around the kitchen, everything seemed normal, but there was something off about her demeanor, a subtle tension in her voice. After dinner, she volunteered to clean up, insisting everyone else relax. An hour later, I wandered into the kitchen to grab a drink and found her speaking urgently into her phone, barely whispering. She stopped abruptly when she noticed me, flushing visibly before shifting into a clumsy small talk about dessert options. Nothing major, but my instincts were tingling. The following day, Kevin suggested a hike up the nearby trail. Sarah declined, citing a sudden headache, encouraging us to go ahead without her. Reluctant to leave a guest home alone, I decided to stay behind, claiming I needed to catch up on some work. I confess it was partly an excuse to observe her more closely, without intruding, just to satisfy my own cautious nature. An hour after the others left, I heard movement from the bathroom, then the distinct sound of the front door opening and closing quietly a few minutes later. Curiosity piqued, I peered out the window, seeing Sarah heading briskly toward the edge of our property, the direction leading to nothing but dense woods. It didn't sit right with me. I slipped on my shoes and grabbed my jacket, determined to find out what she was up to. Keeping a safe distance, I watched her disappear into the trees, my interest now morphed into concern. Was she meeting someone else? I trailed her cautiously, the crunch of leaves underfoot echoing ominously in the brisk air. In the depths of the woods, she finally stopped in a clearing where a small cabin stood isolated and worn down, something out of a horror movie set. She approached the cabin, knocked hesitantly on its weather-beaten door, and stepped inside without waiting for a response. I crept closer, heart pounding in my chest like a tribal drum as curiosity fought with a rising dread. Pressing my ear against the wooden wall, I could barely make out Sarah's voice through the dilapidated structure. It carried a kind of fervency I hadn't heard from her before. There was another voice too, deeper and definitely male, though I couldn't catch much of what was being said. Snippets of a heated conversation floated to me, words tinged with urgency and fear, phrases like "they can't find out," and "not stable" sent my imagination spiraling into dark possibilities. Who was she talking to? My mind raced over potential scenarios, each more twisted than the last. The dialogue suddenly became louder, crescendoing to a point where I picked up enough to understand that Sarah was involved in something dangerous. Something about a job gone wrong, someone being hidden. As she vehemently argued, I realized they were discussing Kevin. She was using him, deceiving him. My stomach turned with anger and disbelief. But before I could puzzle further, the conversation stopped abruptly. The cabin door swung open, and Sarah stormed out, her expression a volatile mix of fury and fear. I pressed back into the shadows, holding my breath as she paced blindly past me, her eyes unfocused and brimming with tears, murmuring something under her breath that sounded like a vow. Once she was gone, the cabin's occupant emerged, a rugged man with a sinister air around him, scanning the surroundings as though sensing a presence, or perhaps just wary of being followed. I remained hidden, anxiety bubbling within as he lit a cigarette and retreated back inside. As silence reclaimed the woods, I knew I had to return, but I couldn't shake the dark chill that now clung to me like a second skin. Back in the house, Sarah seemed composed, her headache miraculously vanished, engaging Kevin with tales of her day spent binge-watching a new series. I sat quietly, my mind in turmoil, wondering when and how I should break what I discovered. As night descended, I checked the front door twice, suspiciously vigilant, and barricaded myself in my room. Sleep eluded me, replaying her words, the cabin, the man, over and over until dawn. In the morning, I decided to confront her, cornering her while Kevin showered, but she preempted me with a shocking calmness. "I know what you think you saw," she began, her voice low and measured, "but there are things you can understand, things better left alone." Her eyes bore into mine with an unsettling clarity that chilled me to the core. I realized then she wouldn't just let me turn my back on her secrets, she had already calculated the risks and maneuvered closer into our lives. Her tone shifted, now almost pleading as she spun a tale of necessity and blackmail, painting herself a reluctant participant in whatever malevolent drama the cabin housed. "You can't say anything," she implored, "for Kevin's sake." The grip of uncertainty tightened around my resolve. I knew Sarah was far from innocent, but now it seemed that punishing her would also ripple into my brother's life, dragging him into chaos. Retreating back to my room, I mulled over what to do, doubt gnawing like a relentless parasite. And that's how I find myself here, tossing my story into the void of the internet, seeking advice from nameless strangers, haunted by the question, am I the asshole for walking the tightrope of family loyalty and moral duty, knowing that whatever step I take will unravel a tapestry of lies, or let my brother sink further into deception? When I was 10, the summer stretched out like an endless horizon, promising adventure with the dust of childhood haste on roads where cars seldom passed. My parents decided to spend a week at my grandmother's house, a sagging relic of the past perched at the fringe of an expansive woodland that whispered secrets in the creaking of its trees. With no neighborhood kids around, I explored those woods, my curiosity insatiable, until my feet felt like roots digging into the earth. One sticky, humid afternoon, I stumbled upon what the kids at school would later describe as a trail of terror, though at the time, it was just a series of strange symbols etched into ancient hooks in the ground itself. They called it the witch's tether, a hidden path supposedly cursed by the woman they said had disappeared into those woods centuries ago. To my naive eyes, it was just a thrilling discovery promising a story I'd flaunt come school. Ignoring the nagging whispers that chill in the summer air, I followed the path further than I should have. The sun was a golden disk hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced like phantoms around me. Each step I took was accompanied by an uncomfortable twisting in my gut, a sensation identical to guilt but born of fear. As the woods grew darker, the comforting chirp of wildlife fell silent. The air felt heavy, pregnant with a foreboding silence that almost forced me back. But 10-year-olds don't heed danger like they should, they are consumed by the thrill of defying the ordinary, of tussling with the uncanny. At the path's end lay a decrepit cottage ensnared by tangled ivy and thyme. Its windows were dark, and the mud-crusted floors creaked under my hesitant steps. Inside, the air was thick, almost syrupy, a potent blend of rot and something sweet, yet acrid. My heart hammered against my ribcage as curiosity warred with instinctual dread. Before I knew it, the barricade of rational thought gave way to reckless bravado. I threw open an old, paint-chipped door that seemed to groan in ancient warning as it revealed a room covered in odd trinkets and dusty jars filled with shadows of once living things. My eyes caught a book, thick with age and mystery, lying innocently on a rickety table. Its cover, bound in what seemed like leather, bore a strange emblem etched into it, a spiral-coiled serpent with eyes that seemed to burn with a smirk, as if daring me to release its secrets. It called to me then, in a way that bypassed sense, its pages whispering promises of adventure, of power over the mundane life that engulfed me. The reckless part of my young mind, the part that adored tales of magic and quests downloaded into it through comic books and movies, latched onto that promise. I gingerly opened the book, half expecting dust, half hoping for something more. Instead, the room began to vibrate, softly at first, then with an increasing intensity that heightened the silence to a deafening crescendo. The symbols danced upon the page, aligning themselves into an incantation that seduced my curiosity more than any of Grandma's old fairy tales. A sudden gust of wind surged through the cracks in the walls, lifting the pages as though the book itself wanted me to choose. I read aloud the words inscribed, each syllable falling with the weight of gunmetal on paper, the air electrifying with a tangible static that made my skin prickle. And then, the room felt still. Deceptively tranquil. Naively, I smirked in triumph, expecting fireworks, perhaps some ancient ghost to spring forth, seeking restitution for its cursed fate. Instead, there was an awful pressuring silence. The moment passed, and reality rushed back. The clock in my mind ticked past supper time, and fear of parental anger drove me out, away from that cryptic book and its unending enigma. Uneasy yet relieved, I retraced my steps back home, dismissing the entire ordeal as a fantastical diversion. But the echo of what I unleashed took root in those woods. That evening, I tossed in bed, haunted not by the task I'd completed, but by the horrific shadows that danced at my periphery. The darkness within the forest felt different, more alive, and as I finally gave in to sleep, they seeped into my dreams. A voice called to me, soft and sinister, telling tales of solitude and vengeance. My slumber shriveled beneath the weight of its narrative until the frosty embrace of dawn finally freed me. With every following day, an eerie unease permeated the air around Grandma's place. Wild animals went missing, entangled in events that eluded sane explanation, folks whispered. Some even claimed to see a figure at the forest's edge, a young girl wearing time-forgotten clothes, her eyes void yet glowing with an ethereal incandescence. As if called by an unseen magnet, I found myself drawn to her. Her presence felt familiar, marked by the resonant imprint of the path I'd opened and traversed. By week's end, my parents packed up and I left. Hopes of ever returning to Grandma's seemed as remote as the moon. But even after we returned home, a lingering chill hung over me, creeping like the shadows themselves. At night, I'd hear whispers, incoherent at first, but gradually coalescing into words of confession and lament. It followed me, wrapping around my life like the ever-present coils of the serpent on that book, weaving chaos into the mundane. At school, tales of my summer escapades spread, but for some reason, I never dared share the truth. No one would believe the reality of nightmares that still gnawed at my hollow core truths. And as years turned, a cruel irony surfaced, stories told of unfortunate tragedies unfurling around Grandma's old neighborhood. A wildfire decimated a portion of the woods, supposedly ignited by a lightning strike, though the blaze bore scorch marks like the spiraling serpent that haunted my youth. Now an adult, with the hindsight clarity age so bitterly bestows, I live, compelled by a twisted determination to return, to correct the dread released. I delve into texts echoing that book's binding, desperate to close the chapter. My sleep remains fragmented, populated by visions of sad eyes and whispered hopes unfulfilled. Each morning, they remain just on the cusp of recall, melting into the sunrise. But the tether I forged tugs relentlessly, and the chill in my spine is incandescent with urgency, an homage to the specter of a child who once traced the lines of an ancient curse, leaving it unfinished. And every return to that place, every visit I make, serve as a reminder of a 10-year-old's encounter with the occult's sinister embrace, a proof that when you call to the darkness, it answers with abandon and its echoes never truly fade. They say laughter is the best medicine, but what if that laughter is laced with something darker? I never thought much of the question posed on Ask Reddit, who is the worst comedian to ever make it big? I thought it was just another harmless thread until I started hearing whispers about an old act, a forgotten figure named Benny Styles, who once cracked up a nation with his laughably bad jokes, yet left a haunting legacy. As I delved deeper into the replies, the stories became less about his terrible punchlines and more centered around an uncanny dark aura that swirled around his performances, a sinister energy that lingered longer than the laughter. Benny gained fame as a hack comedian in the 90s, with his abrasive style and cringeworthy jokes, but it was his enigmatic laugh, an unsettling cackle, that had audiences both mesmerized and terrified. Folks confessed they felt compelled to chuckle even when the punchlines fell flat, as if under a spell. But it wasn't until the night of his infamous show in a dimly lit comedy club that the tales turned from absurd to horrific. Benny, notorious for not just failing to make anyone laugh but actively inciting anxiety, stepped onto the stage and the atmosphere shifted. You see, he didn't perform with typical bravado, no, it was more like he was conversing with shadows. That night, he told a story of a lost soul, desperately seeking approval through humor, and as he went on, an odd tension clung to the air, like a static charge before a storm. The crowd's laughter turned into a nervous symphony, a shared discomfort that washed over the room like a cold wave. One by one, audience members began to choke on their laughter, their faces twisted in confusion. I read on, my heart racing, not because of the absurdity of his jokes, but as I encountered the chilling accounts of those who were there. They recounted a singular moment when Benny leaned in, sweat glistening on his brow, a manic glint in his eye, and whispered, "You laugh, but I'm only telling the truth." The laughter died suddenly, pregnant with dread. People reported feeling an invisible weight pressing down on them as Benny roamed the stage, his shadow stretching and twisting across the floor like a dark omen, distorting the cheerful atmosphere into something far more foreboding. One woman described how she got up to leave, but her feet were glued to the floor, a twisted sense of dread creeping in as Benny's laughter rang out, more animalistic than anything human. They say his act drew on the deepest fears of his audience, like he could pull out their most guarded secrets, laying them bare for the world to see and laugh at. That night ended in chaos. Some fled screaming, while others sat in silence, shocked into a stupor. It was rumored that Benny disappeared soon after, like a ghost haunting the remnants of his own career, but the echoes of his cackling laughter proved hard to shake. People started to report strange occurrences linked to his performances, feelings of paranoia among fans, and unexplainable visions at night, figures in the shadows, cackling just like him. The more I read, the more I realized Benny's legacy wasn't just one of comedy gone wrong, it was a conduit for something that thrived on fear. I began to notice how many had shared their experiences of laughter transforming into something grotesque. Comedians began to vanish, and whispers of audience members showing up in bizarre places, repeating Benny's words as if they were incantations, sent chills down my spine. People became uneasy about the very concept of laughter, and Benny's name faded into myth, but not before sparking the rumor mill that he had made a pact with the dark side of comedy, one that twisted humor into horror. With each retelling of his story, the line between joke and terror blurred further, until laughter became a warning instead of a release. I tried to dismiss these paranormal allegations, until the night I went to a comedy show feeling reckless and aimless, wanting to shake off the mundanity of life. The comedian on stage was a local guy, earnest in his awkwardness, but something about the room felt wrong. Midway through his set, a sudden gust of wind ripped through the room, extinguishing the candles that lined the mantel, leaving a strange chill that made everyone laugh nervously. But then the comedian paused, a smile locked in place, and his eyes glazed over, eerily reminiscent of those accounts of Benny Styles. He leaned forward and softly delivered the words that struck me like lightning, "You laugh, but I'm only telling the truth." The air thickened around us, and laughter turned into silence, spiraling into a panicked whisper of recognition among the audience, a flash of Benny's chaotic energy washing over us. I turned to leave, backing away as my heart thundered in my chest. It felt like I was stepping into the grip of something unspeakable, a legacy that wouldn't die, but only lingered for you to find, lurking in every punchline that turned sour, teasing you with the horror hiding beneath humor. Now I sit here at my computer, staring at the walls as I hear Benny's laughter echoing faintly in the distance, and I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, is trying to unleash his story once more, ready to prove that in the world of comedy, the worst can become the most hauntingly unforgettable, and that's the real punchline hidden beneath every joke. Breaking into homes wasn't new to me, it was practically a routine, a twisted game of cat and mouse where I always emerged the unscathed victor. This night, though, was different. I'd scouted the neighborhood for weeks, pinpointing the perfect target, a decaying house on the end of a cul-de-sac, windows blind with dust, grass in an eternal battle with weeds. Every story I heard whispered the same thing: the old Mason place, they called it, had been vacant for as long as anyone could remember. Kids dared each other to knock on its door, urban legends swirled about restless spirits and vanished vagrants. To me, it was a dark jackpot, a place with history and tradition begging to be part of my less-than-legal activities. Under the cloak of night, I cut across backyards, the moonless sky a hindrance to comfort but a boon for concealment. The house loomed ahead, a monolith of neglected American Gothic with its sagging wooden porch and creaky weathered boards. I glanced over my shoulder, checked to ensure the street was emptied of anyone who might pry, and reached for my tools. The lock on the back door offered little resistance, mere moments of persuasion with my picks and it yielded with a satisfying click. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic I couldn't place. My flashlight carved a path of light through the darkness, illuminating dust-laden surfaces and forgotten furniture covered in white sheets. The place screamed of abandonment, but underneath that, something lingered, the feeling of being watched, of not being alone. I shook off the sensation, accrediting it to old nerves and adrenaline, trying to focus on the thrill of the hunt. My feet creaked against the wooden floor as I made my way through cavernous rooms, untouched by time but marked by its relentless progression. Personal items were scarce, hinting at the previous occupant's hasty departure, half-filled moving boxes and a scattering of belongings. The walls whispered secrets, the gentle tingle of a breeze slipping through broken windows carrying with it voices too quiet to hear. At one point, the beam of my flashlight caught a portrait on the hallway wall, faces frozen in time, two adults and a child, staring out with eyes that seemed almost too lifelike. An odd shiver ran down my spine, a primal instinct urging me to leave, but curiosity had always been my downfall. Drawn by some unseen force, I navigated towards an arched doorway leading into the house's depths, the basement stairs yawning in front of me, a maw of darkness beckoning like a siren's call. The steps creaked as I descended, each groan resonating in the confined space, echoing an eerie lullaby. At the bottom, my light caught stone walls lined with shelves overstuffed with jars, each filled with cloudy liquid and shapes I couldn't quite discern. Then I heard it, a whisper, so soft I nearly dismissed it as a trick of the echo. "Leave," it said, a sibilant hiss that sent ice through my veins. I froze, flashlight clutched like a lifeline, my brain debating flight even as my body stood inert. The words seemed to float around me, taunting, questioning my audacity to invade this space. My hand jerked, sending the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room, revealing more than I intended to see. Along the far wall, a section looked different, as though the bricks had been haphazardly replaced. Gouges marred their surface, frantic scratch marks trailing off into a mess of reddish stains. My heart pounded louder, its rhythm matching a distant thumping that wasn't mine. "Leave," the voice coiled around me again, this time more insistent. I panicked, the realization that I wasn't alone gripping me with icy fingers. Light began to shift around the room, not from my flashlight, but from the walls themselves pulsating with a luminescent shimmer that outlined faces beyond count, expressions twisted in a symphony of anger and despair. Desperation clawed at my chest as I stumbled back, my mind convulsing at what should be impossible. In my frantic retreat, I collided with a shelf, jars tumbling and shattering, their acrid contents releasing a miasma that filled the air with sulfur and decay. The room growled around me, anger incarnate, the faces merging into shapes that hungered for mercy. A scream built within me as if the walls themselves were draining the noise, devouring my terror to fuel their damnation. Detached from reason and gripped by primal fear, I bolted up the stairs, each step feeling more like a battle against unseen hands. Behind me, the rumble grew in intensity, a cacophony of human shapes born from a malicious souvenir and unfinished business. Escape was the only thought that mattered. The house seemed to resist my departure, its doors closing ahead of me, a labyrinth designed to consume trespassers whole. Clawing through the dim corridors, I reached the back door, my salvation just a lock turn away, only to find it immovable as if welded shut by some supernatural force. "Leave," the cacophony moaned, and this time, I understood, it wasn't a warning, it was a curse. With desperation tainted by acceptance, I resigned myself to a mad dash for a window, where a century-stained latch grudgingly gave way, the glass splintered as I barreled through, landing in a heap on the lawn outside. My breath came in ragged gasps as I crawled away, never daring to look back at the place that still hissed my name, alive in ways stone and timber should never be. The town would never talk of this whisper again, refusing to acknowledge masonry's secrets or scented souls tethered to eternity. But I knew, oh, how I knew, attuned to its memory, a reminder branded upon my psyche to revere boundaries not meant to be crossed. The first time I noticed something was off was on my walk home from work when I saw my neighbor staggering out of his house, eyes wild, clothes disheveled, like he had just survived a war zone instead of a typical Tuesday. He kept muttering under his breath, "They'll find me, they'll find me," before he spotted me watching from the sidewalk and bolted like a startled animal back inside, slamming the door behind him. I brushed it off as another case of the midweek blues. Life in our quiet suburb had its oddities, but then the next day, Mrs. Henderson, the sweet elderly woman who always tended her roses, started walking the streets at midnight, her nightgown dragging in the dew, whispering to the shadows as though she were expecting company. Before long, whispers spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People were disappearing, not just leaving, but vanishing into thin air. The first was a local mechanic named Bill. One day, he was fixing a flat tire for a customer, and the next, his workshop was empty, save for his tools rusting under a layer of dust. We all figured he had lost it and skipped town, but then Don, the librarian, went missing too, and the rumors turned ugly, festering dread spilling over every backyard barbecue until there was a dark cloud of anxiety hanging over our community. I started to probe my own life, check the locks, keep the blinds drawn tight. It was when I found Nora, my daughter, crouched in a corner of her room, her face pale and focused on something I could not see, that the paranoia truly set in. I asked her what was wrong, and she whispered back, "Daddy, they're coming." She said it so casually, like she was worried about an impending thunderstorm instead of whatever terror lurked outside. I tried to reassure her, telling her monsters are just made-up stories to scare kids, but inside, I felt the cold touch of fear creep down my spine. Over the next few weeks, people kept disappearing, each one frantic in their last days, avoiding eye contact, bolting for their homes at the first sign of dusk, until the neighborhood was nearly empty. I remember sitting on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, listening to the sound of silence that felt thicker than before, and I couldn't help but feel like a scene from a horror movie where everyone knows they need to escape but are frozen in place. I convinced myself that there had to be something that connected these disappearances, perhaps they had found some dark truth about life here that had driven them to hide, but each time I turned the idea over, it felt like chasing shadows. I decided to put my theories to the test by going to the woods behind our neighborhood, a place we had always seen but rarely ventured into. It was said that a hidden community lived among the trees, filled with people who chose to flee from society, but I needed to know. It was deeper and darker than I had expected, the path became twisted, the trees arrayed like sentinels, and underfoot, the earth squelched in a way that echoed the growing dread inside me. I pressed on, a foolish adventurer listening to nothing but the sound of my footsteps, until I stumbled across a clearing with a ramshackle cabin revealing the slightest hint of light peeking through its cracked window. My heart raced as I approached, curiosity and terror battling within me, until I caught sight of movement within, shadows darting, whispering, laughter that felt wrong in its pitch. I hesitated at the door, the chill of reality washing over me, the stories I had heard of a place no one returned from, of people who never really died but rather exchanged their lives for something darker, cut the air thick around me. It was then I realized the menacing truth: they weren't dead, they had found a way to hide, to slip through the cracks of existence as if the world had no hold on them. My breath hitched as I turned to run, but it was too late. The door swung open, and there stood faces I recognized, dying laughter bleeding through twisted smiles, my neighbors who were never supposed to be here, never supposed to find me. They called my name, smooth and sickly sweet, as I stumbled backward, my only desire to escape from whatever hollow maniacal truth they had merged into them. They whispered of a sanctuary, a place where fear could be cast away, where the dark currents of our society could be washed clean. I understood then that the threat was not in death itself, but in what thrived in the space between the living and the dead. They had turned the very idea of existence into a convoluted nightmare. As I bolted down the path, my instincts screamed at me to run, but I could hear them behind me, their voices weaving in and out of reality, growing closer, more alluring with every frantic step I took. And I knew in that moment it wouldn't be long until they would come for my daughter, where darkness lingers not to claim souls, but to harvest fear, feeding off the shadows of ignorance where we think we are safe. Now every night, I lock the doors, and as the sun sets, I can feel the weight of all those who once called this place home. They don't die, they hide beneath the skin of our community, preserving their truth in the seams of reality, waiting for nights where the veil grows thin and darkness takes form. And I have found my own shadow creeping, whispering to me, waiting for me to give in. I've always prided myself on being an observant person, especially when staying in hotels, like an unwritten code I've cultivated over many years of travel, and yet, one steamy August evening, those rules turned into something sinister that I never expected. I was in a modest hotel on the outskirts of a sleepy little town, the kind where there's always a vague, unsettling hum of something just beneath the surface, but I'd thought nothing of it. After all, I'd followed all the standard protocols. I never venture into rooms I'm not supposed to, I keep my door locked with the bolt secured, and I ensure the curtains are drawn tight each night, as if merely peering outside could invite trouble. When I checked in, the front desk clerk gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something ghostly about her features, like she was molded from the shadows. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue, but as the sun set and a thick fog began to cloak the parking lot, that same unease crept in, nagging at the back of my mind. I shrugged it off, ordering Chinese takeout and settling into the warmth and familiarity of my room. I placed the takeout bag on the table, scoffing at the thought that I should have taken my meal out to the car instead, another unwritten rule I was too accustomed to following. But food was food, and the smell wafted through the air, teasing my stomach into growling with hunger. I started to dig, and when I noticed a flicker in the dim light of the tiny lamp by the bed, I looked toward the source, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw someone moving past my window, a shadow slipping through the mist. My heart raced as I drew back the curtain slightly, but the parking lot was empty, the night air still and silent, the only noise being the distant chirping of crickets. All seemed normal, so I retreated to dinner, convinced I was just tired. Yet, when I settled in to watch TV afterwards, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I recalled the unwritten rule about never using the hotel phone, but when the landline rang, suddenly, angrily, I felt compelled to answer. As I reached for the receiver, it went silent, but a chill swept through me, a whisper in the back of my mind urging me not to ignore that strange instinct. The rest of the evening was filled with uneventful channels and uneasy silences, and despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Then, somewhere around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of a soft knock on my door, 3 light taps that echoed into the void of night. My heart raced again. I recalled the rule about not answering the door after dark, but a part of me wondered if perhaps it was just the anxiety behind being alone. I peered through the peephole, and for a moment, I saw nothing but the empty corridor behind my door. Was I imagining things? I took a deep breath when another knock came, more insistent this time, and with it, a hoarse whisper seeped through the crack, "Please, help me." My gut twisted as I backed away, adrenaline coursing through my veins with every instinct screaming at me to retreat, to pull the sheets over my head and convince myself I was safe. But there's always that curiosity, isn't there? I couldn't help it. I approached the door again and, with trembling hands, unlatched it just a crack. And then I saw him, a disheveled man, his eyes wild, blood smeared across his cheek, and the moment our eyes met, it was as if the world fell silent. "You have to let me in," he whispered, yet before I could respond, the lights flickered, and shadows danced, revealing that the corridor behind him was filled with twisted and hulking figures lurking just out of sight, their eyes reflecting a sickly glow that sent terror spiraling through my chest. Driven by an invisible force, I shut the door, locking it tight, and pressed my back against it, my heart thumping louder than I realized as I retreated, staring wide-eyed at the stark white wall that felt like a prison, just a breath away from the madness outside. I thought of the unwritten rules again and wanted to scream that I wouldn't break them, but I could hear the whispers now echoing in the night. "Let us in," they chanted, a visceral thrumming that constricted around my throat. I was ensnared in absolute fear as I crouched down beside the bed, folding my limbs as if to become one with the furniture. It felt like a game of hide and seek, only the stakes were life and death, yet all I could do was shudder and pray for dawn to break. Time dragged on, and I couldn't tell if minutes were hours or if minutes had stolen into eternity, until the first glimmers of morning crept through the window, puncturing the overwhelming darkness and slow release of terror. I held my breath as I peeked out the curtain once more, my heart stopping as I realized the corridor was empty, but the horror didn't lift so easily. I shuffled back, the adrenaline receding like a tide, and picked up my phone to check out, but to my surprise, the front desk was eerily quiet, as if everyone had vanished overnight. I grabbed my bag and bolted down the hall, the unnerving feeling of eyes following me prickling my skin, but as I approached the exit, the same clerk stood there with that same wooden smile, not a flicker of acknowledgement crossing her face. "You must check out now," she crooned, an edge to her voice that told me it wasn't a suggestion but an order. I turned back, swallowing hard, and in that moment, I glanced down an alternate hallway, where I spotted something small and dark, something that looked like a body writhing on the ground, its shape moving in vague, pleading motions that felt familiar. I stumbled back towards the door, feeling the very air around me warp and constrict as senses heightened and disbelief clouded my mind. "No," I whispered, a wave of nausea rolling over me. The last unwritten rule of staying in a hotel seemed to hang in the air: once you checked in, you might never truly check out. And as I sprinted through the sliding doors, my heart racing wild and thoughts screaming of escape, I could have sworn I heard the whispers behind me growing louder, a cacophony of voices altogether saying, "You shouldn't have come here." It started like any other dreary Thursday evening, my head pounding after churning through yet another soul-crushing day at the office. The flickering streetlights cast eerie shadows, elongating the figures of the sullen commuters, each lost in their world of monotony. I usually zone out on my way home, my thoughts dulled by the daily grind, but that evening, an unsettling feeling clawed at my consciousness. As I trudged past a particularly ominous alleyway, a soft yet frantic whimper caught my attention. My heartbeat quickened, my instincts screaming for me to ignore it and continue walking. But against my better judgment, I stopped, a magnetic force drawing me in. Peering into the dimly lit gloom, I could barely make out a figure hunched over, their outline trembling in the chill of the night. Swallowing hard, I felt an inexplicable urge to step closer, as if some otherworldly presence was compelling me to intervene. The air was thick with tension, each breath like inhaling the remnants of a nightmare. As I approached, the figure turned slightly, revealing a woman's face streaked with tears and desperation. Instinctively, I crouched down, offering unspoken reassurance because, in that moment, words felt futile. Her eyes, large and pleading, spoke of horrors unsaid, and when she finally choked out the words, it was like a veil lifting, revealing a reality harsher than I could have imagined. Between ragged gasps, she told me about a man, the kind of monster hidden in plain sight, who had promised her salvation but delivered her into a waking hell instead. My mind raced, a fierce internal battle as the beer and Netflix night I had envisioned slipped further from grasp. I tried not to glance nervously over my shoulder, telling myself that he couldn't possibly be close, that this scenario couldn't be as dire as it seemed. Clenching my fists to steady my nerves, I helped her up, her skin shockingly cold against mine. As we moved out of the shadows, I strained my ears for any signs of pursuit, the new silence somehow more oppressive than the noise of the city around us. In hushed tones, I learned that she had been captive for the past week, taken from her normal life to serve someone else's dark intentions. I shook my head in disbelief, my brain struggling to catch up with the situation, desperate to wake from this nightmare. We made our way hastily toward my small apartment, each step gaining speed, driven by the urgency of newfound purpose. She clung to me as if I were a lifeline, the night encroaching upon us with every fearful glance I cast into the abyss of the alley. By the time we reached my building, I realized the absurdity of what I'd done, inviting a stranger into my home, no clear plan or thought about what came next. But there was no turning back, an insidious part of me had already decided that this was right. She flinched at the scrape of the elevator doors closing, a reflex honed by the horror she'd endured. Inside my humble, cluttered living room, I offered her a cup of tea with hands that trembled, trying to mask my growing panic under a veil of concerned authority. The shift in setting brought a brief, illusionary calm. Here, amidst the familiar scent of my morning coffee and clutter of my uninspired life, she seemed to shed some of the fear, though shadows still lingered in her eyes. She spoke sparingly now, as if fearful that putting experiences into words might solidify their horror. Her words sketched an image of the world parallel to mine, one where people become pawns and survival isn't guaranteed. I listened, spellbound by the sheer force of her survival instincts, my mind barely able to grasp the full extent of her endurance. We talked through the night, my questions tentative, afraid of triggering more pain yet eager to understand. It dawned on me that beyond horror films and urban legends, evil truly exists in our world, lurking in corners we often overlook. At first light, the realization slammed into me that decisions must be made. I had to act, really act, not just react, to bring someone truly responsible into this unfolding nightmare. I contacted the police, battling the fear of what her captors might do if they sensed she was no longer under their thumb. In the ensuing hours, a flurry of uniformed officers and sincere promises appeared, the gravity of the situation sinking slowly yet deeply into their practiced professionalism. Throughout it all, she remained by my side, clutching onto the solidity of someone who listened, who believed her when others would question. My once mundane world swirled with chaos, and by the end of it all, she was whisked away to a place of safety. As I watched her leave, something intrinsic within me shifted. I'd played a part in saving a life, yet an emptiness seeped in. Here I was, the unlikely hero in a story that seemed far-fetched even as I narrated in my head. The sheer surrealness of it all, how my ordinary yet comfortable life intersected with the edge of human darkness, was what struck me most. No friends to tell, no family expectant of my call, my account holds lesser weight than those photos that accompany a news headline, snippets of a stranger's unfolding tragedy. I've thought to write her story here, half temptation, half warning, urging those like you to heed cries in the darkness overlooked. Yet speaking aloud feels like betraying a sacred trust, the anonymity her tormentor relished, now undone, a quiet insurrection of a simple life intersected by fate's gnarled hand. So now I sit here, words pouring into ether, into you, reader, confessing not just to the audience, but perhaps to the universe. I hold pieces of another's survival, echoing truths that still haunt the recesses of my nights, casting shadows too vast for my single, inscrutable soul to anywhere else to ever share. When my phone buzzed with my mom's name flashing across the screen, I felt a familiar pit in my stomach, an instinctual dread that had grown over the years as she seemed to morph into this overbearing force in our lives, especially my sister's. My sister, Emily, was an adult, yet somehow my mom couldn't fathom that, insisting on meddling in every detail of her love life, which only made it more complicated. So, when my mom posed the question, Ida for not telling my mom to back off, I had to give a long pause. It wasn't that I didn't care about Emily, I did, intensely, and I had witnessed her suffer through my mother's incessant probing, criticism, and unsolicited advice, but I also knew that if I intervened, I'd be throwing a lit match into an already raging inferno. Instead, I tried to stay neutral, messaging my sister to ask how things were going with her love life, a whole swirl of budding relationships, emotional hot messes, and one very serious guy named Brandon. I thought for sure Emily would rave about how wonderful he was, possibly even telling me he's the one, but instead, I was met with silence that day, which soon turned into several days, each one gnawing at my insides as the dread morphed into guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was complicit somehow, letting this happen without stepping in. Then one night, I finally heard from her, but instead of joy or excitement, there was only hurt. "Mom won't stop," Emily texted bitterly. "She keeps calling him too pushy and saying I deserve better." I tried to reassure her, at least validate her feelings, but the conversation spiraled. I laid my card on the table, admitting that I thought she should just have an honest talk with our mom. That was the wrong approach, because as soon as I mentioned the confrontation, Emily exploded, calling me an enabler, saying I was a coward for not standing up to our mother. I didn't sleep that night as a knot twisted in my gut. Was I really that big of a coward? The next day I decided I needed to confront my mom instead, thinking perhaps a little honesty would be the answer. I pulled her aside during lunch and tried to delicately approach the topic, explaining how Emily was feeling overwhelmed by the pressure. But to my utter shock, my mom's face darkened, her brows knit into a furious scowl. I hadn't seen her angry like that in years. "Emily doesn't know what's good for her," she snapped, her voice sharper than I remembered. When I was her age, I wasn't chasing after fools. I was taken aback by the venom in her words, wanting to understand, but instead, I felt the dread swelling again as she dug deeper into her tirade, insisting I should be grateful she was steering Emily clear of misfortune. I thought I'd managed to keep my voice calm, but when I finally said, "You can't control her love life, Mom," those words hung over us like a thundercloud. I underestimated how much those words would shatter the fragile illusion of our happy family. At first, it felt liberating to stand up to her, but then I was met with the cold walls of her disappointment. She turned her back on me, dismissing my words as childish, as if I'd just confessed I hadn't brushed my teeth in a decade. I felt hollow, as if I'd traded one nightmare for another. Days turned to weeks, and what followed was an eerie silence that settled over the house like a thick fog. Emily withdrew further, and our mom became more entrenched in her own view of the world, the air thick with unspoken conflict. I tried to reach out to Emily, who had broken things off with Brandon after a particularly bitter argument fueled by our mom's incessant interference, but every attempt felt like I was tiptoeing through a minefield of emotions erupting between us. Our family dinners grew quiet, no longer filled with laughter. Every glance exchanged was like a silent accusation. One evening, through exhausted tears, Emily finally threw her hands in the air, admitting that she felt trapped between us, that her happiness was abandoned in a flood of opinions. "I don't even know how to go back to who I was before Mom decided she knew better than I did," she cried, and the weight of those words crushed me. Just then, my phone buzzed again, this time a garbled message from our mom. "Can we talk?" I knew what was coming. My stomach twisted in anxiety as I found myself standing on the precipice of disaster. She waded through the door like she was getting ready to battle, and I braced myself against her anger. "Emily says you're upsetting her," she spat. "Are you going to take her side?" I felt the walls closing in, with the past few weeks exploding like a pressure cooker, and my voice wavered as I said, "Mom, we have to stop this." It wasn't enough, nothing was ever enough for her. The argument evolved into chaos, words volleys vomited like ink splatters on a page, and at the heart of it was the raw truth. I had let our family suffocate under disillusionment, and now, as our words echoed into a void, I realized I didn't just stand at the edge of our imploding family, I had run to the cliff and jumped. In that moment, as I stared into my mother's frustrated, horror-stricken eyes, I could see that I had unknowingly carved my own role as the antagonist, and with that realization, the finality of our newfound separation settled heavily in my chest. Each day transformed into a suffocating cycle of fractured relationships, and when the dust finally did settle months later, I was left with the gut-wrenching question, had I really not been the asshole for not standing up sooner, or was I, for not realizing sooner what the meddling truly cost us all? I promised my dying wife I'd find our son, a vow made in the quiet despair of our cramped hospital room as the machines beeped around us like mournful ghosts, the soft light casting a pallor on her face that became eerily familiar as the days turned into weeks. "Promise me, Jack," she whispered, her voice barely a thread above the silence, and with tears brimming in my eyes. I nodded, though my heart weighed heavy with the knowledge that our little boy had vanished into the woods behind our home 6 years prior, a realm that always felt more like an echo of nightmares than a sanctuary, and after months of fruitless searches and local whispers about strange happenings, I was desperate, and when Linda turned her gaze into the distance one last time, I felt the chill of inevitability settle within me, her grip on my hand slackening as her breath stilled forever, leaving me alone with the haunting promise. The first weeks after her death blurred into each other like watercolor paint left to run on an easel. Friends and family came to offer condolences, their sympathetic glances stinging more than the thoughts of my own son's fate. Yet the moment the last visitor departed, a thick silence blanketed the house, and I felt an unsettling pull toward the woods, ignited by a growing obsession to uncover the truth of our son's disappearance. Was he lost, hiding, or had he been drawn to something more sinister lurking among the trees? Armed with a flashlight and a bag packed with nothing more than a few supplies, I ventured into the dense underbrush, the air thick with moisture and an unsettling stillness, broken only by the rustling of leaves above. It felt wrong, trespassing upon his forgotten playground, a place that teemed with the laughter of childhood but now seemed to mock the tears that stained my cheeks. As I continued deeper into the woods, the shadows stretched unnaturally, and strange sounds echoed, whispers intertwining with the slight crunch of twigs beneath my feet, and I fought against the instinct to turn back. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but with every crackle, it sounded more like distant, echoing cries, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Hours in, with my hope waning and doubt creeping in, I stumbled upon a clearing I recognized, though not in its current state. The old treehouse we built one summer loomed in the distance, its wooden frame half collapsed and cloaked in thick vines. Yet as I approached, heart racing, I noticed something off, an altar of sorts, stones wrapped in tattered rags, their sheer abundance forming symbols I couldn't decipher, each one whispering tales of sacrifice and darkness. It struck me then that before my son had vanished, he'd been obsessed with exploring the unknown, playing games that made me uneasy. Had he stumbled upon something he shouldn't have? I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back, and just as I turned to leave, a noise caught my attention, laughter, wild and untamed, ringing out like a bell tolling for the lost. I followed it deeper into the woods, driven by a primal need to find my boy, but the laughter twisted into shrieks as branches clawed at my skin, and I was drawn deeper still, trapped in a maze of trees that felt alive, their gnarled roots grasping at my ankles like fingers pulling me into the abyss. When I finally broke free, breathless and panicked, my heart sank as I found myself not in the clearing but in an entirely different place, where the shadows danced with a life of their own. The moonlight pooled unnaturally at regular intervals, and before me stretched a series of paths, each one illuminated by an airy glow that pulsated like a heartbeat. I felt a chilling presence shadow my every move, and it dawned on me that I wasn't alone, that whatever game had ensnared my son had revealed itself to me as well. I called out his name, the sound of it echoing in the heavy air, but the only response was a cacophony of rustling leaves and a low growl that reverberated through the ground. Terror clawed at my mind as I spun around, realizing the paths were shifting, as if the woods were alive and taking pleasure in my terror. Then, in a moment so surreal, it felt like the universe had folded, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a small silhouette darting between the trees, too quick to discern. But in my heart, I knew it was him, my boy, and he was running, not toward me but away from something far more sinister, and regardless of the chilling figure chasing him, a presence darker than the night, I had to save him. I charged forward into the woods, driven by a mix of horror and hope, adrenaline flooding my veins, but no matter how quickly I pressed on, the distance between us stretched endlessly, until an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. With every footfall, the feeling of being hunted intensified, the forest thrumming dangerously with an unsettling life of its own, and despite my heart screaming at me to stop and turn back, the sight of him was a fragile thread I couldn't allow myself to sever. Suddenly, I tripped over roots, crashing to the ground, the wind knocked out of me, and I laid there panting, struggling to regain composure, when I noticed a shadow flitting across the moonlight. It was closer now, watching me, and as I scrambled to my feet, I was confronted not with a mere child, but a dark entity, contorted and grotesque, its eyes hungry and merciless, a being that seemed to embody every nightmare I had ever harbored. Everything I'd been through flashed in an instant. I saw Linda, our summer days, and our son's laughter fading into the trees, consumed by darkness while I stood as a powerless bystander, and as I took a shaky step back, the haunting realization dawned on me. The woods had kept so many promises, feeding off my hopes and fears, and what I found here in the depths would forever haunt me, a secret entwined with my son's fate. As I stood, poised on the precipice of knowing and forgetting, destined to either embrace the shadows or abandon my search for him entirely, leaving me shattered and broken as the echoes of laughter twisted into a haunting chorus around me, urging me to surrender to the darkness. I always thought my life was pretty normal until the day my mother came to visit and demanded my kids call her honey. It started innocently enough. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and my mom was coming over to see her grandkids. My children, aged 8 and 6, were running around the yard playing tag while I prepared lunch in the kitchen. When she arrived, her face lit up in that way only grandparents can manage, a smile wide enough to show her jagged teeth, remnants of her young adulthood filled with unsupervised partying. She pulled them into a bear hug, the kind where you can feel her seam-splitting polyester sweater prick against their cheeks. But as the day wore on, I noticed something unsettling. My mother kept insisting they call her honey. At first, I thought it was just a harmless quirk, but she pressed it further during game time, using that syrupy tone that grated on my ears, as if my kids were her little minions and she was wielding some magical spell. "Come here, honey, let's play," she cooed, but the word felt wrong, too intimate, bordering on unsettling. It didn't sit right in my stomach. My mother was my mother, not a weird caricature of an overly affectionate grandma out of a sitcom. I snapped at her, "Mom, please, they can call you grandma," but that only made her puff up indignantly and launch into a tirade about how honey was more endearing, how it created a special bond. I felt my face redden, a fierce heat flooding through my veins because it was more than a name, it was an invasion of our boundaries, a violation of something sacred. That night, I tucked the kids into bed, and as I kissed them goodnight, I told them to let Grandma know that it was okay to call her Grandma, not honey. The following weekend, she returned, more persistent than ever, crouching down to their level and coaxing them with sweet treats, sugary bribes, but my little ones eyed her warily, sensing the discord in our family. When they hesitated to comply, she turned to me with narrowed eyes and an edge to her voice, "You're making them disrespect me." I felt the hairs on my neck stand, my heart thumping hard as I defended them, telling her, "I'm teaching them respect for boundaries, not disrespect." That visceral exchange dug in deep, planting a seed of doubt in my mind. Was I the asshole for asserting my position? As the days turned into weeks, the tension escalated. My mother began using guilt as a weapon, trying to undermine my parenting before dragging my children into her web of manipulation with sugar-coated threats about holidays being cancelled if they didn't comply. It was a twisted game I wasn't willing to play, but her unyielding persistence kept gnawing at my resolve. I shared my frustrations with a friend who suggested that perhaps I was being too harsh, too rigid. Their words stung worse than any accusation my mother had thrown my way, and I spiraled into a dark chaos of self-doubt. I ventured onto a parenting subreddit, thinking to find solace, only to be flooded with comments that made me question my sanity. Let the kids decide. One user chortled, but my instincts screamed that this wasn't just about names, it was about control, about my mother trying to rewrite the narrative of our family. I took matters into my own hands, drawing a line she couldn't cross. During her next visit, I engaged the kids in a game that involved shouting their names with a lot of enthusiasm. "Call your grandma." "What do you want to call her?" I urged. Eager, they both shouted, "Grandma." But my mother stood motionless, the tension crackling in the air as if the wrong word could spark a fire. In response, she smiled tightly, almost painfully, and muttered something about how other families would jump at the chance to show for a grandma who loved them so much. My heart sank, realizing that I had become the villain in my own narrative, and she was playing the victim to an audience of invisible cheerleaders. I knocked on the door of my therapist the next week, confessing my fear that the family holiday plans would unravel into more manipulation, into guilt-haunted dinners where half the people wouldn't even know how to respect my boundaries. He supported me, encouraging healthy communication, but as I left, I felt that insatiable dread creeping back in. One fateful night, while I lay in bed, my phone pinged with a text from my mother. It was a photo of my children at the park with her, a towering figure in the vibrant sunlight with a bright red balloon tied to their wrists, smiles painted on their faces, but there was something twisted about that image. They were holding hands with her while an uneasy feeling lingered in the back of my mind, a nagging thought that I was losing control. The message simply read, "I love being there, honey." It felt like a punch in the gut, and I recoiled as if I had slapped my hand on a hot stove. Then came whispers of topics from friends, hints of my mother's side painting me out to be the villain, rousing sympathy since I was the one trying to control the kids instead of letting them have fun. As another holiday approached, I rallied the courage to face her directly. I invited her to join us for dinner, her expression a mixture of delight and sly cunning. I laid it all out, every accusation lingering in the air around us, but halfway through my conviction, she spoke, her words dipped in honeyed venom, expertly twisting the narrative until the room felt too small, the walls closing in. "You're the reason they don't love me the way they should." I stumbled backward, the world spinning as my heart sank, crumbling into despair. It spiraled into insults and accusations until our feud caught fire, eventually breaking down our family ties. The kids, who once brought joy, were now fragments of a shattered household, torn between two powerful forces, their mother's determined stand for boundaries and their grandmother's relentless pursuit of affection. I wondered if I'd become my own worst enemy, calling it tough love when it felt more like an endless cycle of despair and guilt. My friends distanced themselves, caught in my mother's whispers of my so-called tyranny, and I began to wonder if the r/no sleep community would ever understand. Was I the asshole for standing up against the invasion of my children's love, or was I unwittingly playing into her hands, a pawn in her sick game of emotional chess? With these thoughts prowling my mind, I lay awake nights, contemplating if this was the price to pay for something as simple as a name, a price measured in family, in love, and in the haunting specter of a broken connection that now loomed over every holiday, threatening to return until I could feel the air grow cold and dark every time my mother's name scrolled across my phone. I don't know what's worse, allowing them to call her honey or losing out on the precious moments that united us as a family because she could indoctrinate anyone, even my own flesh and blood, and leave me wondering if I'd lost the entire war for something I thought was simply an innocent name.